Welcome to the Mega Blast Podcast. I'm your host, Jason McDonald. My goal is to get to the truth through conversation. The Mega Blast Podcast is produced by Arts and Opinion, an online journal housed at the Archives of Canada. Visit us at artsandopinion.com. I hope you enjoy today's guest. Welcome, Albert Nerenberg. Thanks for coming on my podcast.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a long time. We were talking off camera since we saw each other. It's been, I guess, 20 years. I don't know. Do you remember the last time we saw each other?
I think that's about right. You know, it reminds me just off the bat of how people are with psychedelics these days. They'll say, "Oh yeah, 20 years ago I used to do psychedelics just for fun, and now I'm doing it kind of half seriously." That's like this podcast.
Right.
I used to sit around and record stuff just for fun. You know?
Now it's sort of serious.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that actually brings me to something, because that I should mention quickly is I just started doing this not long ago.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher at Cégep and everything.
Right.
You may know I have a whole career.
Yeah.
And so I started doing it because I kind of thought, I think I went on John Hamer's podcast.
Yeah.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I was on John
Yeah,
Hamer's
I know.
podcast.
Yeah, I heard you. So that kind of broke through my, sort of stage fright, as it were.
You're like, hey, how hard can it be?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I got to. The second time, I kind of thought to myself, maybe I could do it. And then, so I thought about what I would do. And so I modeled it on a few people. Maybe he is one, I think, because he's a local guy who kind of does it on the side. He's also a teacher. People like Sam Harris.
Harris, I interviewed him. Yeah,
really?
Yeah,
really?
good,
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Before he was famous. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Now he's famous.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to tell you that it makes me think what you're saying now, that, 25 years ago, we were drinking in the bar one night and we were talking about writing and what you do or something.
Yeah.
And somehow you started saying to me, you could be a script writer or something. You were telling me I could do stuff like that. And I was like, oh, okay.
This guy's full of shit.
Yeah. Well, we were half pissed or whatever. It was 2:00 in the morning at the Double Deuce. I don't know,
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank you for that encouragement, and it was a nice thing of you to say, and it's not entirely wrong. I've had a couple of articles published on Arts and Opinion, which is where this podcast is posted. So.
Actually, but you know what's weird about you saying that is that because my background, I should explain it, I have a background in improv, and I think improv came to me very early. I'll tell you this weird story that when I was 16, my mother got very sick, terminally sick, and sadly died of cancer. And I was kind of cut loose. Well, part of the story was okay, but I was kind of cut loose. And I had planned to go to university, but when that happened, I think I thought, I want to go live. I think because I just seen my mother die. So I ended up somehow in Calgary, Alberta, because at that time that was one place where you get jobs. And literally arrived in Calgary the day that the mayor, Ralph Klein, said, there's too many Eastern bums coming to our city. And I was like, literally,
I kind of remember that.
Yes,
when he bought bus tickets for people from Quebec and Ontario or something.
Literally, that was the day I arrived.
Oh my God! Okay.
I arrived, and the mayor says, "There's too many bums in this town."
Just so we could explain to listeners, I think at that time people would travel across Canada. Some people getting welfare, and then sometimes stay on welfare in different places. And I think he was. I'm not justifying.
No, I think that was the one place where you could get jobs. There were jobs in Calgary at the time.
So it wasn't the welfare.
It wasn't the welfare. It was the jobs. Yeah.
Because I heard that if you went into a welfare office in Alberta, they would give you a bus ticket. That was like a legendary thing where I did to BC or Toronto or something.
I think that came a bit later, but
anyway, sorry.
It was their vision. It was all the riffraff of the country was attracted to Calgary, and I was.
You're one of them.
Yeah. Exactly.
So anyway, sorry I interrupted. Yeah, go ahead.
And so I got a job in a gas station, and it was my first job. I was pretty excited about it actually, but I realized I didn't have the most exciting life. I would wake up early, go to the gas station, pump gas all day, and go home. And I just thought, is this my life? And I happened to see a poster for this workshop called the Loose Moose Theater Company. And so having nothing else to do, really, I sign up. And I little did I know that the guy who's running the workshop, is the modern inventor of improv, Keith Johnstone.
Wow.
The people that are in this improv workshop, there's a few others that come later, are later become the kids in the hall. And there are other
serendipity, Albert.
Other people there but it's also that Keith Johnstone is a sort of unrecognized great Canadian genius, that he developed an approach and a style of improv that was very important. Now I'm looping back to my story of talking to you. Now you don't take this the wrong way, but one of the things that I learned, what improv teaches you, is that people are more talented than we realize. I used to say that, like, I think 90% of the people can be great at improv if they took the time, and that a lot of people have incredible talents. We just live in a world which doesn't value. We don't need your talents that much. It's part of the society we live in. We know you could be a virtuoso, but go back to mopping the floors, because that's what matters.
That's a beautiful story. I love that approach to people, because I mean, as an educator, I'm constantly faced with this with seeing
similar
students.
Things. Yeah,
and I'm always because most people they can be more than they are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is kind of the Jordan Peterson message of like aspiration, and people should be encouraged. You were doing that with me.
I have a good Jordan Peterson story for you later. But maybe,
Okay. Well, you want to tell it now?
No, better later.
All right. Okay. Well, it's just. I mean, regardless of what people think about Jordan Peterson, he's somewhat of a controversial figure, but he does point to.
He's interesting.
He's an interesting thinker, and he's really opened up some ideas of positivity, that there's a lot of potential in the world that perhaps we're not tapping into, which is kind of what you're saying. I think he's saying the same thing.
Yeah, we could have a good Jordan Peterson conversation. Yeah. I think that he's I won't go into it now, because it's like a big.
Well, why don't we just sort of start? I understand you to be a filmmaker and a laughologist, and I also thought writer. I had that noted down in my notes.
Yeah, I'm a writer. Yes, sure.
Yeah. You also mentioned that you're into hypnosis, which I had forgotten. Maybe because you hypnotized me, right? Yeah, I don't know.
It is actually, weirdly enough, kind of my bread and butter more than anything else.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was kind of wanted you to talk a little bit about, is just your more recent endeavors. But later on, I want to go back to the Oka Crisis, because what you did there, because that's really interesting.
Maybe just so people don't get confused, I'll give you a kind of like, because people often ask me, like, can you explain your bio a little bit? And because it's confusing. So to explain that, I started off as a reporter, a junior reporter. I was the editor of the McGill Daily when I was at McGill. But I always did improv, because of the story I just told you, at the same time. So at a pivotal moment, I split off and started an improv troupe, both in New Orleans and in Montreal. It was called Theater Schmieder. And this was a time when improv was a pretty new and out there thing. And so it really affected my life, though. And this is where, like you, I saw that the average person is far more talented and creative than one would think. I think there was a guy who wrote a book called Weapons of Mass... not weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass education, or something. And I forgot the name of the book, but he says, if you really look into it, genius is as common as dirt, which is a really interesting view of humanity. So anyways, to make a long story short, I became a reporter. Then I got a job at the Montreal Daily News after being in New Orleans for a while. And I became a columnist. And weirdly enough, I think at that time, I'll just tell you the story very quickly. All my friends, when I went to live in New Orleans, all got gigs at the Montreal Daily News, like reporter jobs. And they called me up and they said, "You idiot! You left town at precisely the wrong time," which is one of my talents. And they said, "We've all got jobs, and you." And at that time, I was doing like improv on street corners in New Orleans, which I loved. It was a great life, but I was not making money. And so my friends convinced me to come back to Montreal, see if I could get a job at Daily News, at the Montreal Daily News. So I get back and they're like, all the jobs are full. There's no chance of you getting a job here. But there's one thing you can do.
Sorry, that's just so ironic, right? Yeah. You leave when the jobs come in, you come back and they're gone. It's like, anyway, yeah.
And so they told me one thing you can do is you can freelance. If you can find like a crazy story, that nobody else knows about, we'll print it and we'll pay you per story. So being a young Turk at the time, I'm like, okay, I'll try this. I'll see if I can do it. And I'd get up in the morning, I would stomp the streets, and I would just walk along and I'd be, wait a second, there's a guy lying on the street corner and it doesn't make sense and he's been shot. Or I would just find crazy story after crazy story. And so
can you just tell me like what kind of things, because when I walk down the street, I mean, I don't see dead people on the street. Like, I'm wondering how you did that a little bit.
I would just see often I would
just go up and talk to the people, like, what's going on here.
Well, to give you an example, in the summer, one year, walking up St. Lawrence Street, I found this weird liquid. There was a liquid that was sort of pouring along the sidewalk. It smelled incredibly bad, and it seemed to have no explanation. So I do a bit of research, and I find out that the putrefying garbage that has been left in certain parts of the city is liquefying and is pouring down the sidewalks.
Wow.
And is becoming,
that's a story. That's a story.
Slime,
literally, like you can find on the street.
That's right. I found toxic slime on the street, and so I go to my editor and I said, "I found the toxic slime," and he's like, "Great story."
Now you need to find the what's the guy in The Simpsons, the evil dude
who put it there?
Yeah. Well, what's that evil guy with his
Burns,
Mr. Burns. You need to find Mr. Burns.
But it was just that the whatever garbage pickup was not particularly good. It was a hot summer, whatever it was. Anyways, but that was
interesting. Okay, yeah. So that tells you what.
To give you very precise examples, the story. What was interesting about the Montreal Daily News is they rated their paper every day. Rated meaning they saw how many papers they sold, and so the front page and the big stories made a huge difference. If they had a good front page, lots of sales. Bad front page, low sales. And so I cracked a few stories. One of them was the arrival of neo-Nazi skinheads in Montreal. And
I've heard you talking about
this. So that's why I used to talk about
this. Yeah, because
I mean, I literally it started with a really crazy experience. I forgot the name of the bar, but it was a famous. It was the bar that used to be Rufus Rockhead's famous nightclub on
Craig Street or St. Antoine, right? Yeah.
Had become
near where not the Forum, the Bell Center is now. Yeah, just down. Anyway, yeah. So
I was just there with a friend having like a kind of like I remember being like a very relaxed conversation, and there were some punk type people around. I didn't think twice about it, but then basically I went to the bathroom. We had this really weird experience, and as I'm leaving the bathroom, the door slams shut, like in reverse. And I'm like, what's going on exactly? It's like I was just trying to figure out like what's going on. And I wait a second and I slowly walk out and I see there's like a skinhead, a bunch of skinheads standing outside. And basically they had slammed the door, or they had tried to slam the door on my face. But the timing was off, and it hadn't really, I didn't know if it was me or if it was somebody else. Anyways, what happens next is, I walk past these guys and I see them walk over to a guy who's just bought the album of the band it's playing. Back in the days where you would literally buy a vinyl album, and he's bought the album. It's sitting on his table with his girlfriend, and Skinhead walks over to him and says, "Can I look at your album?" And the guy, being a polite guy, says, "Sure, no problem." And Skinhead literally takes his album and cracks it over his knee.
Wow!
All the guy does is stand up, like, "What are you doing? Why did you do that?" And immediately he gets knocked down, and I saw something I'd never seen before, which is a ritual that you would only understand if you knew skinhead violence, where they basically knocked the guy down, two guys, and began kicking him in the head as hard as they could.
I've seen it in movies where they all start stomping.
It's a thing. It's a cultural thing, and they often do. What I found out later is it's often done in a racist way. So they'll go up
like
to
some black guy
or an Asian person. Yeah. They'll gang up on them, and before anybody knows what's happening, they will. It's not a fight.
Surprise attack.
They knock you down, and then they're kicking you in the head. So of course you can't even get up. You're stunned. You're usually in really bad shape.
We're not usually ready to be attacked.
Right.
Most of us are not walking around in the modern world expecting to be assaulted by many people at the same time, right?
This was a pivotal experience for me because I had seen skinheads around, but I'd never thought of them positively or negatively. I had no opinion about them. They were just, different. Now I suddenly saw the phenomena, which I then looked up, white power skinheads, and I saw that these guys was their thing.
Is this what, in the 1980s? Just to situate people as
I think late 80s, early 90s.
Early 90s, okay.
So then I find out that it's a thing that's rising in the city, that there's a bunch of them. they at that time they affiliated loosely with the Ku Klux Klan, which is not really a Montreal thing, but they were here, and that I saw them beat up a bunch of other people. So what I did is that I was a young punk at the time. I got my hair cut short. And I didn't quite go undercover as a neo-Nazi skinhead, but I went to all the places where
I think you'd have to change your name.
Well, the thing is,
name like Nerenberg.
I never introduced myself as
I'm Albert Nerenberg. Yeah.
Did I say something wrong?
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah.
But so you didn't change your identity. You just sort of went up and kind of tried to hang out with them a little bit.
I did. It wasn't so hard to hang out with skinheads at the time, and so I basically shadowed the skinhead movement for a while and saw what they were doing, which was terrible.
Jesus.
And then I wrote a bunch of stories for the Montreal Daily News, and the Montreal Daily News circulation went through the roof.
Wow.
Maybe some of it for the wrong reasons, because they were like, dangerous skinhead punks attack random people. It's like
terrible. It's really awful stuff, and you're profiting from it. But on the other hand, I mean, that's what journalism is. You're supposed to inform the public. If you hadn't have written those stories, who would have? Not that many people would have.
Right.
Only the families and friends. Of
that's right. That's right. And I think it did a public service to warn people about this phenomena, and I think eventually it went away. But the point of it was. At that time, I didn't have a job. Circulation jumped so much that they started saying, bring us more stories like this. So I just started becoming an expert in sort of finding offbeat, unusual stories to the point where I was making a living.
And you were writing these stories.
I would write the stories, and they would send a photographer.
The reason I mentioned that is that off microphone before I mentioned writer, you're like, I'm not really a writer. And here you are telling me you started your career basically as a writer, so which is interesting. It's just an observation, but maybe you don't write so much now.
It's just this weird thing. It's more an improv thing. Improv trains you to be non-linguistic because you're not supposed to be too deep in the story. But of course I'm a writer. Yeah, I've written 4 or 5 screenplays. I've written documentaries. I've written lots of articles, and so yes, I am a writer.
So you bring this non-verbal improv approach to writing. It sounds like is that what you're saying? I'm not sure if I'm.
Basically, it's the idea that it's in improv. You learn like what is happening is more important than the story.
Right.
But stories, of course, are important, and I also just think that we live in a culture that is a little bit excessively linguistic. But I think I'm going on a bit of a tangent.
That's okay. That's the whole point, is to explore things.
Yeah. Well, so the point with the weird experience of the Montreal Daily News was that because I at the time had the energy to find crazy news stories every day, I eventually got hired. And the weird twist is, even though I was at the bottom of the totem pole for most of my time there, they then switched around and they made me a columnist, started once a week, twice a week. And then one day they approached me and they said, would you like to be the daily columnist for the Montreal Daily News? And I was like, sure, it's like a job. And the twist is at that time, I think it was 26, I was the youngest city columnist in all of North America.
Wow. It's an incredible accomplishment for
an unintentional accomplishment. Yeah.
It's funny how we can sort of back into these things without, and it also it also tells me that it's a good idea just to kind of try doing things. I mean, just to be kind of like, hey, this might be fun, just for the fun of it. I mean, and then maybe it'll lead to something,
It's also weird about how the universe works. I think that in some of the work I do, we look at abundance. A lot of people think in their life there's no wealth or abundance in my life, and I always tell people, I'm always saying the story of my life is look deeper. When you look deeper in things, you find things out. And I think that people would have said, are there that many weird stories in Montreal that you could actually build a newspaper on it? And I'm like, yes,
I bet you could fill volumes.
Yep.
I mean, there are nearly 4 million people in the Montreal area, right? Or more, actually. I think it's 4.2. That's a lot of people. As you just pointed out, individuals often have interesting stories and creativity. So, I mean, just think about the multitude of different stories that could be uncovered if you just went out and found them.
Well, to give you an idea, too, is special about Montreal is that years later, I end up working for the Montreal Gazette. I am briefly the correspondent in New York City for the Montreal Gazette. And And I try sort of the same thing. Maybe I can find the craziest stories in New York and become like a columnist in New York or something like that. But what I discover is Montreal, sort of moment per moment, is far weirder than New York. New York, there's weird news in New York, but the weird news in New York is gory. 4 people shot dead.
More crime and kind of stuff like that.
It's just nasty. In Montreal, it's like weird. Strange orange gas plume over delicatessen, weird riot by people with rotisserie chicken, that's Montreal,
Yeah, this came up a little bit in Sonny's podcast, and Chris Berry. I don't know if you know Chris Berry from the 222s.
Yeah.
There's also a sort of very unusual linguistic and cultural mix in Montreal that is really unique to perhaps the world.
Yes.
What I like to think of it as the French word carrefour, an intersection of different cultures. Because I've seen a map once of the Amerindian sort of nations that existed in this part of the world, and there's the Algonquin people north of the St. Lawrence River, the Iroquois Confederacy and then there's another group, and it's like, it strikes me that that's where Montreal is. It's geographically situated between 3 nations, as it were. French Canada to the east, English Canada to the west, and then the United States to the south, right? So you've got this. I think there's something to do with that's going on. That makes it really unusual.
I used to interpret it as like Montreal oddly is a city like for example, you go to New York, let's say like downtown Manhattan is run by the Irish, that somebody's running the town, and or is culturally dominating the town, but Montreal, what made it weird is I think it's actually changed. But when I was living in Montreal, nobody ran the town. It wasn't an English town. It was not a French town.
It was depended what you're talking about.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's this mid zone that was like kind of a neutral area where anything goes.
No man's land.
That's right. And the weirdness happens.
Yeah. No. I think it's a really, really interesting observation. It's not clear to me what because it seems like multiple cities, depending. It's very segregated in a certain sort of a way. Like you could say, like the Anglophone community is sort of ghettoized in some. I don't mean ghettoized in a negative way, but just. And then you've got Francophones, you've got a lot of allophones, and so on the other hand, we are geographically proximate to one to the other.
Yeah,
it's not like it's like 100 kilometers away to where the people in Montreal North or something live. Yeah. They're right there, and then there's Westmount where we are now. So.
Oh, I mean, Montreal is a spectacular place, but it's gone through. It's a city that's in constant transformation.
Yes. Yeah. It's that's actually something. Just as a little bit of a teaser for a future podcast. Because I want to move on, but I'm doing a whole sort of a series on a new form of Quebec identity, which would be, I think there's a place for a discussion about that now that the sovereigntist movement is sort of gradually diminishing, and the former Anglo-Franco thing is really 20th century now.
Yeah.
Like if you're a young person, like my students,
they don't care.
They don't understand what I'm talking about if I bring that up. Like they're like, what's like? They're like, yeah, people speak English. What's this? There's a conflict between those people. Like what? Like what are you talking about? At one time I tried to do a thing in class like 10 years ago about like and the students were genuinely confused. Like they were like they didn't understand. It was a very long article too, so they couldn't really follow it.
Yeah.
But they inhabit a world where Montreal, where French has always been more or less the dominant language, and they're not French Canadians, most of them, but they speak French in their homes and with their families. And so there's a bit of a discontinuity going on right now with what it means, because traditionally a Québécois would have to be a French Canadian. And that is something that, I mean, you and you were born here. I wasn't born here. I'm an adopted Québécois.
I wasn't born here. I wasn't born either. My family was from here, so that's my.
Oh, okay. Where were you born?
Yes. This is like part of my story. I don't know. So I happened to be born in London. My family's from Montreal. My father, mother all grew up here. Just before I was born, my father got a job in London, Ontario, at the University of Western Ontario.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up being born in London. My parents didn't like Ontario. They thought they were in some kind of penal colony, because at that time Ontario
It kind of is for Quebecers, like Anglo Quebecers,
at that
like
time
where you go
Ontario
to,
it was not an interesting place.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with my parents longing for Montreal. And Montreal's this legendary,
Okay.
magical place that I would hear about. And then we would go and we would summer here or spend more of our time here. So as a kid, I grew up like thinking that Montreal was the place. And so when I finally went to school and later in my life, I became like this big, Montrealer.
That's actually I feel a bit of a corollary story because my mom was born in the UK, but she immigrated with her family to Montreal when she was a child, and she grew up here till she was about 17. Then she moved to Kingston, where I know you have connections as well,
Yeah.
and so I have family there. And so I grew up in Toronto, but my mom, as like sort of like you, there was this presence of Montreal and the UK that she would tell me about that almost seemed sort of mystical or something.
Yeah, Montreal
You
is
know?
just a magical city, but
Yeah.
it was all relative, and I actually think that unfortunately for Montreal, it's gone away. And Toronto is, for example, the more interesting city now.
Yeah, yeah, you think so?
I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
interesting. I grew up there and I left there a long time ago, and I don't know if it's because of just negative experiences growing up or whatever, but I don't go there very often, and I don't, and I'm always sort of like,
By the way, I'm a sort of weird expert on this topic. I made a documentary for the CBC called "Let's All Hate Toronto," and it's about why people hate Toronto so much.
because they live there, like me. Yeah. In my case, yeah, yeah. No, but actually, I just wanted to just mention this because
Yeah,
maybe I'm doing this whole thing. I want to sort of, and I'm going to do some of them in French. I've already done one in French with
yeah,
a woman from Venezuela about what it
yeah,
means to be a Quebecois or a Canadian.
yeah.
And so maybe we could do something about that. I could watch your documentary, and then maybe we could talk about that in a
Sure.
future podcast because that might
Yeah,
be really cool. But okay, so to return to, I just wanted to cover a couple of things
yeah,
before we get to the Oka thing. You're a laphologist, which is something that's a little bit obscure to me.
yeah,
Like, I think most people would,
yeah.
a friend of mine in Minneapolis, Sandy Stein, put a comment up when I said I was going to talk to you. She's like, "Oh, I want to get a PhD in laphology." She's kind of joking, right?
There should be. I mean, there is a legitimate science called gelatology, which is the science of the study of laughter.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are people who are gelatologists. Now, I've met some of them.
Gelatologist. That's a humorous name.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
But they are generally not humorous. They're not funny. They're dead serious.
That's hilarious.
Um,
The people who study laughter aren't good at laughter.
Yeah.
Right? Is that one way to think about
yeah,
it? Yeah.
they aren't.
Cool.
Like the way other academics who study other behavior are
They ruin things. Right?
I don't know if they deliberately ruin. They're just not. They just are like they're being neutral. It's like if I I'm studying laughter. I'm not laughing. I'm
Right.
studying it. Right. So let me explain that. I made a documentary. Whenever you finance a documentary in Canada, you have to have a good angle. I mean, it's something's changed, but you have to have a really wild angle. My producer used to say, you have to find Elvis alive. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not going to be easy.
Not
And
one of
so-
his thousands of impersonators. You have to
Yeah.
find the real Elvis. Okay.
But I did find a story like that. I basically found out that no one had ever done a full investigation of laughter, even though, and then you're going to say, wait a second, that can't be true. Charlie Chaplin or whatever. But I'm going to say
They're
that
trying to make people laugh.
but Charlie
Right.
Chaplin isn't laughter. Charlie Chaplin is humor.
Right.
There's many films and documentaries about
Interesting.
humor. So humor is a cognitive process. You got to figure out that something is funny or see that something is funny. While laughter is a much more instinctive, primal. And what we discovered was
Wow.
that laughter is
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
laughter is a human universal, and this is a big deal because previously to that, anthropology, a lot of other sort of cultural sciences had shown like big distinctions in human nature across culture. But what laughter proves is that every culture, every civilization ever laughs, and they
People
more or less
laugh.
do it the
Yeah.
same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
More or less the same way.
So it transcends language, it transcends culture. It's all human beings understand the concept of spontaneously reacting with laughter to
That's right.
something that they find amusing or
It doesn't have to be amusing. It's like a baby thing. All babies start laughing at about 6 weeks. Yeah. So the reason why you're going to make the distinction with humor is that humor might vary. What's interesting is that there are some cultures that have no humor. They're in Indonesia. Okay. They're like, you cannot tell them jokes; they'll stab you in the forehead. And
I was thinking about Germany, but so maybe them too.
It's funny. It's so funny that you say that, because when I went to Germany, I actually love Germany.
Me too. My uncle lives in Germany. I have family there. It's a wonderful country. I mean, all love for Germans and everything. But
I would joke at them. I would say, is there such thing as a German comedy club? Like, bring me to it. I want to see it. But they're like, oh yes, there is. We have comedy clubs.
Then you go and you're scratching your head like, what is this? Yeah. Well, there's a bit of a crass joke about that, about how the Nazis chased out all the best comedians. I don't know if the people have sometimes commented that the
first thing that goes. I mean, look, the first thing that goes.
Well, yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah, and any repressive. That's a really interesting point that you mentioned immediately about the spontaneity. I wanted to comment on is. Some of the greatest comedians who do politically incorrect humor, Mike Ward or Norm Macdonald, these are brilliant. Some of what they're doing is they're exposing things that are supposed to be taboo that maybe don't need to be taboo or shouldn't be taboo. Yeah. And people naturally react with laughter or cringing or some kind of a reaction, right? Because these are things that we're not supposed to cover. I mean, and then we're supposed to. This is just an interesting comment I thought of when you were saying about the involuntary nature of it, right?
Back to what you had asked, like what
laughology,
what a laphologist.
Yeah.
So luckily I was able to make a documentary for CTV called Laughology, and basically they allowed me to sort of do this kind of crazy investigation. First, of this the question of the universality of laughter, and then incredibly strange laughter phenomena that also points back to the universality of laughter. So a lot of people don't know this, but in 1962, there was an epidemic of laughter in Tanzania where 35,000 people started, called the Tanzanian laughter epidemic.
That is wild.
35,000 people started laughing and could not stop.
So it's like hiccups, but with laughter. That's something like that, right?
A good way of a good parallel. Yes, it was like people got worked up and they couldn't let go. And
so when you get the giggles, everyone's gotten. Some people get into a thing where you just and you're trying to be serious, like you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you can't stop laughing about something, right? It was like that, except it went over the entire country. Or something.
It even went into Uganda. That's part of the weird story. Yeah,
and jumped across the border.
But wow. People would go to fall asleep laughing, and they would wake up laughing.
That is so
and
wild.
A lot of people going through it did not think it was that funny because they couldn't stop.
I mean, you're stuck in this constant laughing thing, and you're trying to eat or whatever. Right? This is fascinating. I'm sure you explored this, but
I went there and found people who had been in the original epidemic, and I found out that there are aspects of the epidemic that persist, meaning there's still people that have laugh attacks. Wow. And it's a common thing in Africa. It can
really?
Yes, but I found it also in the United States. It can happen. It happens in Africa. Tanzania is a particularly interesting place because where it happened is a pretty remote part of Tanzania where I went to, where the families are very big. Like you have like 7 cousins and you grow up together, and the people are very close. African people are very warm, loving people, and so they naturally tune into things together. So we both find that crocodile chewing on his tail funny. We're all gonna laugh like really hard the same way about it.
So it's something to do with the clan familiar connections of the people that led to that.
Exactly. Right? The way the epidemic happened was apparently a group of teenagers who were stressed out, girls, I think, at a girls' school, started to laugh in the back of the classroom. And the teacher basically got really upset and told them to stop. And it made them laugh more, and it crossed a pivotal line. They couldn't stop.
Did the teacher start laughing?
No, then the teacher got the principal. When the principal came, it's all logged. They wrote a log about what happened. Wow. The principal there is like, if you don't stop laughing, there's going to be serious consequences, which makes them laugh more. Then now they're in a full-on jag. They cannot stop, and the kind of laughter is so contagious that the other kids start laughing. Now you've got a whole classroom laughing.
And they don't want to, because they can see they're going to get in trouble. Some of them are straight kids.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
But they can't stop. And then it spreads to the other classes and the other classes. And then the principal makes this fatal mistake. He says, we can't control them, send them home. So they send all the laughing kids home, where they then infect their families. And then it spreads to 35,000 people. I'm not exaggerating. Looking up Tanzanian laughter epidemic.
Wild. So that's a case because there's nothing humorous going on there. There's no humor there, right? Just to get back to your original point.
So what a laughologist is, or what I discovered, I'm not the only one to discover this, is that when you separate humor from laughter, you get something interesting and bigger. You get to a bigger place, because humor, like I said, is taste, cultural oriented. We might like Monty Python, other people might not. Yeah. But laughter is a huge universal. And so this like blew my mind. But I'll tell you even why it was sort of important more in a sort of, I'm going to say soul way, but Tom Green was going through an interesting time at this time.
The great comedian, Canadian.
Yes, yeah. So Tom Green, I think, had become a really big deal and gone to Hollywood and kind of sunk his ship, where he was not doing so well. And I remember that he was doing a show where he described driving on the highway and with his crew and finding a dead moose at the side of the road somewhere in Montana or something like that. So being Tom Green, I remember he describes this experience.
Takes a selfie with it or something. Yeah,
it's worse. Yeah. Tom Green gets out and he says, start, roll the cameras, and he sticks his head up the rotting moose's ass. Jeez. Then I think he barfs. But the point was, I looked at this and I thought, is this what you have to do to be funny these days? Yeah. Like stick your head up the corpse of a dead moose? And
does it even get a laugh? Because it sounds kind of disgusting to me.
That's right.
Although it's so wild that it must sort of give that reaction.
But I remember thinking, I started to ask the question at that point, like, all comedians in a way are questing. Like comedians are questing. What's the ultimate joke? The ultimate funny moment.
They're trying things, right? They try something and it doesn't land. They try something else, it lands. Right?
The question is, what are they? Deep down, what are they really searching for? And I kind of like this feeling of there being an ultimate joke. And then when I discovered that when you separate humor from laughter, there it is. The ultimate joke is laughter itself. That laughter itself is this fundamental human universal. We all do it. We all do it the same way. It all makes us feel human, better, happier, lighter. It was my it was my discovery. I can say I'm not the only one who discovered it, but it was a big deal when I finally
in this quest about laughology.
Yeah. So in the documentary that happens where we figure Tanzanian laughter epidemic. I mean, other weird things that make it matters even weirder. I went to India to find out the origins of laughter yoga. So laughter yoga is an exercise technique where you try to laugh as much as possible, and it's like this incredible.
While doing yoga?
No. It just borrows some of the breathing techniques from yoga.
Okay.
But when I go to India to find the guy to Mumbai, by complete terrible coincidence, as I arrive, the Mumbai massacre starts taking place. My God. Where literally
nothing funny about that, right? Yeah.
It was the most unfunny thing that could happen. Yeah. But that was. If people see the film, they'll understand it's kind of an interesting twist, because you see there's lots of shots of people crying. I went to the shooting scenes. Somebody I know, I don't want to invade his privacy, but there's a great Montreal actor named Michael Rudder who, by complete coincidence, was in Mumbai at the same time. Wow. Michael Rudder was sitting in a restaurant when it was machine gunned and was shot.
Wow.
Miraculously, he survived.
Wow.
He's back in Montreal. A wonderful human being, but I think it was a very tough experience for him.
So this, I mean, I'm just curious as a side note, did you do any journalistic work about that? Just since
it's in the film, and what I think is interesting, and I think this is when you study laughter, it changes your view of. So there's a conventional view of life, which is that when we are happy, we laugh. When we're sad, we cry, and these are polar opposites. But actually, when you study it, you find out actually that's not true. The polar opposite.
They're sort of connected somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes when people laugh really hard, they cry. Sometimes when they cry really hard, they
start
laugh.
laughing. And also people crying. Whenever I see it in movies, it always sounds like they're laughing. And when you see someone really break into tears, it sounds like they're laughing.
These are these critical, cathartic behaviors. But what when you really study laughter, what's a better opposite for laughter actually is stress behavior. So seriousness, gravity, and horror is a better opposite to laughter than crying, and that's what I experienced in Mumbai. I saw the ultimate seriousness, people being shot at random for no reason. And not knowing who's going to get shot next.
We often comment about that. Like there's, we mentioned the Nazis not being funny, but there's also, it's nothing serious. Nothing totally serious.
It's like next week at Just for Laughs. The
Nazis coming up. Yeah, and the same for like Islamist jihadists.
Right.
It's like they're totally opposed to this idea of joyousness or something.
You hit the nail on the head. Yeah. So this is what laughology, which I'm going to say is like an invented science, but this is that what it shows you is that the problem in the world is seriousness and over seriousness, and that's what Islamists are. That's what religion, often very religious people are. It's not that they have their weird religion where they worship a angry guy with a beard. It's that they're so serious, and they think everybody else should be serious too. Yeah, they're the anti-fun police.
It's interesting because it's really important to be serious at times and to focus at things, and like if you're gonna do something like write an essay I'm just thinking about from an education perspective, but you can't be laughing all the time in class.
Not all the time, but I think that the need for seriousness has been greatly exaggerated. I like to be that on my tombstone. The need for seriousness has been greatly exaggerated.
I'll try and remember that in case I'm trying to.
But go ahead.
No. It's really a few things spring to mind. One is that just if you look in recent years at the way that comedy has become subversive. Again, back to Mike Ward. The Human Rights Commission went after him. I don't know if you know this.
I know that story.
Follow that story. Yeah. I went and saw him do comedy at Club Soda, and he talked extensively about that. I mean, speaking of serious people, these are people in Quebec City or whatever who are like, sort of like, oh, somebody complained about this joke or whatever. Right. We need to investigate. Well, this is very serious. This could harm someone or whatever. And it's kind of like you sort of understand it in a philosophical level. Obviously,
you see their
be insulting.
Yeah, and
on the other hand, but putting it into a government bureaucracy where they're going to be going around, it's like that's sort of the ultimate overly serious kind of application.
Exactly.
And what's interesting to me about that is the only way that kind of censorship ever works is if you go all in. Yeah. You have to put people in a gulag. Right. I mean, I'm not suggesting this is good. I'm just saying that if you're going to repress a comedian, you have to actually kill the guy or get him out of there. Because if you don't, it just makes it more popular. People are like, whoa, Mike Ward is bigger than ever now in Quebec and in Canada.
I would say this is Jordan Peterson. What made Jordan Peterson is his attack on political correctness. And even though I think Jordan Peterson is often wrong.
He's a pretty serious guy.
Speaking
of seriousness,
no sense of humor. He's often wrong about a lot of things, but there's this sort of perception that there's a toxic political correctness, which is just a complicated story. It's a complicated story.
You don't think there is? Because
I think there is.
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah,
I think there is.
There is one.
I think there's always been. It's nothing new. I think there's always been. I mean, it used to be more that it was created by the institutions.
Yeah.
And I think that the sort of it's a weird thing. I look at my daughter. My daughter is 16 or 17 now, and the way that she often rebels against me because her dad is like off in Peru doing ayahuasca and psychedelic this, psychedelic that. Her idea is, Dad, can you just settle down and like speak normally or whatever? The kids, they respond. Yeah. Their rebellion is gender identity. You guys are too
rigid about our
gender, and part of the rebellion is to be politically correct because so much in a tired way. Boomer and Generation X culture is like we show rebellion by political incorrectness, and they're just tired of that. They've heard it over and over again, and I understand. But it doesn't change the fact that we need freedom.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Because like the freedom thing is something I've sort of increasingly, as I go through my life, I keep returning to and find. And I mean, Jordan Peterson has this whole thing about freedom of expression being the sort of, he has a hierarchy of freedoms, right? And I think he's right that if you don't have freedom of expression, the other freedoms sort of also can be infringed. There's something about speech. Now, it's a tough balance because you don't want people to be deliberately rude. I mean, I understand. I tell my students at the beginning of the year, I tell them, look, and I'm sort of, my branding as a teacher is like, freedom of expression, and fun and stuff like trying to be funny in class and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have on the door of my office, I have the George Orwell quote. Have you ever heard this? If we're not free to tell people things they don't want to hear, then we don't really have freedom of expression, something like that. And the Noam Chomsky one. Anyway, I've got them confused. There's two that they have. But what I think is really important is to sort of go down a fine line where once it goes into an institution, like we have in Canada, 7 out of our 10 provinces have human rights commissions, and these are extrajudicial bodies that don't have to follow the rule. Like, you're not innocent until proven guilty in these bodies. You don't have the normal rights and all that stuff you would have being charged in a regular court.
Yeah,
these things would never see the light of day in a court. Half of the things that go to the human rights commissions.
I agree. I agree that it is. At once, it is terrifying. But let's look at an example of the other side. Of
terrifying. I would use that word. It's not that
maybe,
bad, but
maybe
sinister,
concerning.
Yeah, concerning is a better word.
But on the other hand, you have that terrible story in London, Ontario, of
the Muslims who
Muslims were run down by some random idiot.
But that's a criminal act.
What I'm saying though is that we know that's what hate speech does. Yeah. Hate speech gets people run over by racists and also other things. I mean, I just think history has shown that hate speech does have an impact. But it's funny. I'm Jewish, and so I'm I've followed these stories forever. I still think I'd still rather live in a freer, more expressive society. And I think part of life might be it's okay. A little bit of hate speech is not going to actually kill you. And might be just a result of living in a complicated society.
Well, I think it's impossible. I mean, if we live in a free society, first of all, we have to accept that not everyone's going to agree with us. That's the first thing. And it's not that I like Nazi speech. The reason why obviously I don't, right? Or anything.
I like this quote.
Yeah.
Look,
I don't like. Yeah. Let me put it on the record. I don't like Nazis. Yeah. Right. But it's not that it's just that it's sort of like one of those, which is a worse alternative? Well, the government having the power to suppress somebody for saying something, who's going to decide that is the problem? Or letting people talk and having people, and I think once you set the precedent of someone saying this is wrong and this is okay, then eventually it's going to, and I'll give you an example. In Ontario a couple of years ago, this was before the pandemic, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, somebody made a complaint about the anarchy sign being spray painted on, and so is it a matter of time? It's fine as long as we're suppressing the Nazis and the this and that. And then my concern is always that once that's instantiated, that it can be abused. But maybe I'm overly paranoid. I don't know.
I think I think a bigger question. I'm opening up a whole kettle of worms. But does anybody think that during the pandemic there was an open and free discussion about the science or the realities of the pandemic? I think just about no one thinks that. So what we do have as a culture, on one hand, there is a lot of freedom of expression. We have the social media is quite incredible in terms of what you used to be able to get away with. But on the other hand, but I don't see that. I don't see it as the human rights commissions. I just think it's more the matrix.
Right.
The way people think. People think in cliches. They think in very routine and repetitive ways. And so you can't blame it all. There's no overlord.
Fair point. Yeah.
Sort of saying you cannot think this. It's just more a way that just human beings tend to organize.
Well, there is. I mean, you mentioned this thing about political correctness. Most of the problem with political correctness is sort of a social phenomenon where people sort of, where people are. First of all, there's self-censoring, which. Self-censorship is a good thing in the sense that there should be taboos, right?
No, of course
there should be like I should not feel comfortable saying racist things or something like that because there should be a taboo there. right? It's just a matter of where that line is and how much are we going to tolerate. It's not really not an easy problem, right?
Yeah.
But
I think it could be done. It could deal with it in a healthy way because it's stigmatized this way right now. One of the worst things that can happen to you is at work or to get caught doing something racist or sexist, and instead of you learning from the process, it becomes this big stigma, and that's not progress. If we want, most people don't want to be racist. Most people don't want to be sexist. They just don't know how to do it.
There's also an incentive problem. I mean, I've been a sort of an amateur student of economics for a really long time, and in economics, that people look at what are the incentives. So people look for social capital. So one way to get social capital is to, promote the idea that you're a victim, which is what is happening, right? That's one way now, right? So
okay, you just open up. You should call your podcast "Can of Worms" because I think we're opening up one can of worms, another can of worms. I just want to tell you one really crazy story. Like in the documentary business, there's a bunch. What happens is that ideas get pitched around. Sometimes there's common ideas. Different filmmakers are thinking the same thing. There's an idea being kicked around that nobody can do, that everybody kind of wants to do.
Please expose it on my podcast. Yeah.
Victims. It's a really big problem. Our culture has created a victim, self-victimization, a victim story, a victim culture that is extremely toxic and extremely dangerous. And it's bad for people. I can explain it a bit from a hypnotherapeutic angle. Gabor Mate has a great explanation for it. So people suffer all the time. People have experienced abuse.
All life is suffering. That's like one of the teachings of great religions. Right? Yeah.
And people are abused. People are mistreated.
Yeah.
Somebody's listening to this right now got abused or mistreated. But what Gabor Mate points out is that you can recognize that somebody mistreated you. You can recognize somebody insulted you, hurt you, or abused you. But if you stay in the role of victim, you are trapped. And not only are you trapped, you actually become toxic because you're always looking for a reason to justify your role. Once again, Jason McDonald is making me feel bad with his podcast. Once again, just like they always do. And we live in a culture now where the game for some people is to be the biggest victim.
Yeah.
If I can be the biggest victim, then
you get social capital from that, right? Which is really kind of backwards. It used to be if I was the greatest, strongest, like if you go back to classical times, for example, if I was Julius Caesar, and then you bunch of victims, you're a bunch of wimps or whatever.
That's right.
You. But now it's almost
reverse.
I think it's something to do with Christianity. Christ was sort of the ultimate victim, and he accepted it and all this, or something. And there's maybe a deeper story there. But I think I'm opening another can of worms.
In therapeutic strategies, it is a key part of people coming to terms with their what's happened to them. So a person. Right. So let's say somebody's abused as a child. You have to
go through that. You have to realize that it happened to you and understood that it hurt you and all that. Right. Yeah.
And but then it's important for you to heal from it and no longer be the victim and move on in life. But a lot of us stay stuck. And a good example of this. Actually, I forgot what I was going to say right now, but I was going to say there's some really critical examples.
Well, just a quick, maybe you'll remember it, but go ahead.
I was just going to say the point is that nobody feels like a lot of people are talking about this documentary. Nobody can make it because they will be attacked by all the victims out there.
Right. It's almost like a catch-22.
And the victim industry.
You know who has made some work on this? A guy called Shelby Steele. Have you heard of him? He's an African American writer and anyway, he's a speaker. And he's focused specifically on the way that the Black American community is sort of cleaved between a kind of victimology narrative versus a more, hey, let's just move on with things narrative. And it's kind of, that's really where you see the conflict in that community in the 2020s.
Interesting.
And his whole thing is sort of like, don't get basically he has this thing where, you have to, he uses the term leave the reservation, which is sort of very politically incorrect, but basically get out of it and kind of move into a different mind frame and just say, look, the opportunities are there for you. You could go and do it. Now, I don't want to, please don't think I'm saying there's no racism or anything like that. That's not what I mean. But
it's not a denial. It's all the same thing. Gabor Mate and other people are not saying that you pretend that you weren't abused or you pretend that you weren't victimized. It's that you get out of you need to like. I'll give you an example. If you were at a party, cocktail party, and people are having fun and laughing, and then somebody stepped on your foot and it hurt. Let's say maybe it hurt enough that you were like, "Ow, that my foot hurts." But okay, as the party goes on, if we keep going back to you, Jason, how you doing? He's like,
my fucking foot, you motherfucker! You stepped on my foot, you bastard!
We're like, okay, but that was an hour ago. And then later in the party, everybody's like, cheers, and how you doing?
My foot. Remember when Albert stepped on my foot 2 hours ago?
Exactly. Yeah. You see how unfun it is and how toxic it is.
That's the other thing is there's no humor or laughter about that mindset, right?
Yeah, because they keep trying to prove more. They want to go deeper. Yeah. Then they're like, can you see the bruises? Can you see there's some skin lesions from when he stepped on my foot? See, they're going deeper into the hurt.
Yeah.
And the hurt might be there. Maybe it was there. But also the other thing is, this is another thing you'll notice. People who have really suffered.
Yeah.
People who have really...
The Viktor Frankls of the world, for example, right?
They're usually not going... my legs are sore.
Yeah. Well, there's also a survivor bias too. People who've gone through, like Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp and he survived, right? Which meant there must be something about him that can get beyond it. So there's a kind of a grit there that is like, okay, I'm going to move on with my life, and I'm going to, And the ones who couldn't do that were stuck in that victim mentality, maybe they couldn't get through it. And that's not a value judgment about them as people. It's just
the reason it's important for us to talk about this is it has to do with the cultural valuation of things. So let me explain what I mean. The way you get out of the role of a victim is that you start to see, instead of seeing yourself as a person who's always being hurt or having your foot stepped on, you're like, you might change it to, I'm going to go step on Albert's foot. I'm the stepper on, or no, I'm the person who walks around the party and nobody steps on my foot. You've now changed your role. I'm going to go enjoy the party.
Right.
You've moved on. I'm going to enjoy being with friends. And but if we as a culture start saying, the most important person is the person who's had their foot stepped on.
Yeah.
And they need to be able to tell their story and to raise their narrative. And then you're like, okay.
And we give them social capital of the people who play that up. And the other thing is, let's say somebody steps on your foot at the party.
Yeah.
The first thing they might do is apologize. I'm really sorry. And in a reasonable world,
that's right,
a reasonable person should accept the apology if it's genuine. If the guy's, sorry, Albert. Ha, ha, ha. Then you go, okay, I'm not. But if they're like, oh, my God, I'm sorry. I stepped on your foot. I didn't mean to.
Right. Exactly. Right? Or even next step. Let's say you did mean to step on your foot. Then you say, you should, I was like, Jason.
That requires a deeper apology.
Right.
And it's like, maybe I'm not crying, but just, oh my God, I was such a jerk. I thought I would be funny or something like that, right?
And that should be accepted too. Then we all move forward and we stop being concerned with the trivialities of who stepped on whose foot, And
well, this gets back to the social media thing. There's a British writer who you may have heard of called Douglas Murray. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's somewhat a controversial guy, but very, very smart. And he's written an entire book called The Madness of Crowds, about how on social media, these kinds of phenomena. And he talks constantly about how we need a way in our time for this kind of apology and reintegration of a person into the community. Because right now, with the cancel culture, this doesn't happen all the time or anything, but there are cases where people are just supposed to be expunged from the community in some way, forever and gone. And no matter what they say, in some cases they're sort of giving these weird, almost North Korean-like apologies. There was just some examples he gives of British footballers who they find a tweet from 2013 or something, and they're up there, I'm sorry, or Kevin Hart or something like that.
Yeah.
And they're sort of making an apology. They're trying to apologize, and then they're not seen as genuine, or I don't know what's going on there, but do you just before we move on, because I want to move on, this is a really cool conversation, but the time is wasting here. Do you think that the cancel culture is still ascending, or do you think that it's peaked, like the wokism and all that? Do you have any view on where it's going? Because there seems to be different opinions. Some people think that it's still an increasing threat. Some people think it's getting less and less.
Look, like I remember, like I said, I've got a teenage daughter, and one thing that I found funny is that, I've learned a lot. Like, for example, the difference when I was a teenager, and probably you too, I remember the horror that I had friends who were gay. And I had the horror of it let's say, the idea of it, let's say, people knowing. So I had a gay friend. People
shame around it.
Yeah, it was near fatal. You could get killed for being gay. And the difference is now that with my daughter's scene, it's not even that people are gay. People are like, "Dad, we're non-binary. Stop being so gender-oriented." Dad, gender is a social construction, which
some of it is.
That's right, and I actually kind of agree. I agree, and I think that there's something beautiful about these kids. They're not afraid to be many things, including gay, and so all that is good, and that you have to attribute that to wokism, that there's an enlightenment around gender, which is valuable. The maybe unvaluable part is the way it is negotiated. The culture hasn't kept up as like. Why not teach people? Like, I'll give you an example. I always get this. I'm like they them. There's something problematic about they them. So somebody says they're coming to the party. Yeah, I'm like, should we put out
people?
Yeah, right? Exactly. Put out so many chairs. And if you sort of make a joke about it, is that one person or three? Yeah. Then that's not funny. But it is funny.
Of course, it's funny. Of course, it's funny. Of course, it's funny. It's also it's the thing that because my niece actually went through a period where she was transgender. My brother lives in California and he has three daughters. And this was she now has gone back to being fine with she and everything, and for a while she changed her name from Violet to Vex, and now she's going by V and everything. And so I gave this a great deal of thought because I wanted to be really respectful of my niece, and I love her, and she's really really smart and interesting and everything. And I thought to myself, the name thing I think is totally cool. If I wanted to, my name is my name. Right, so I can say my name is now, beautiful chair or something, and it's a bit weird, but like that. Right, right. And if I say to you, Albert, you should call me beautiful chair, then that I'm not imposing anything on you because my name belongs to me. But they and them don't belong to any individual. It's a part of the language, and the English language is not invented or prescribed to anybody. It's sort of a natural process. So this idea that you can say, hey, that's not you're doing something harming me, doing something to me by using this English word is something that it's like innocent to me. I think there's almost an overstepping there. In some senses,
that's the thing. I mean, I just think that some people pointed out that every generation rebels, and this generation, the way they're rebelling, and good for them on some level, is by overthrowing the rules of gender.
And it's our job also to maintain what is, and to sort of allow the things that are the dead wood to be burned off, but keep the things that are useful. If that makes sense, right? Because we don't want everything. I don't know. We don't want like was the Russian Revolution a good thing? I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupt. I don't know where you were going with that.
I think that the like I said is that it's what you said originally. The problem is that the culture is not actually a good place to learn. Meaning, when somebody is at an event or a cultural event and they use the wrong pronoun, they get shamed, and then maybe it gets written down in the newspaper. And instead of them actually getting the pronoun right and just moving on in life, we now make an issue. We literally make a big issue.
There's no reintegration with the apology and all that kind of stuff.
And there's no emphasis on that. It was more about people, and this is also it's like a high school thing, an in-out thing. We are the people who understand pronouns, and we exclude the people that don't. Yeah. But also before it was we were the people who understood that racism is bad, and we exclude the people who don't. Instead of making an effort to turn racists into non-racists, you know what I mean? And that is still the problem with society, is that we there's a lack of meaningful learning around political issues because we're more interested in being right.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is that there's an assumption that the linear progress is going in the right direction, and it has been. And you wonder if, are there social changes which might not, things that we think are progressive that maybe are not progressive? That's a very difficult problem. That's a tough one. Because everything, I'll just give you an example of how things progress, but some things don't change. So, if you go back to the things like, the racism stuff from the 60s, homosexuality being accepted, and then you have gay marriage, you have all these things have moved in a kind of linear direction where the left-wing progressive views have become, the Overton window has moved in that way, because I think that our culture has made moral progress, and we've recognized that individuals have the right to be what they want to be, and so on. But one particular issue has not been solved and may never be solved, and that's abortion. Because people who are, and I'm not making a claim of what I believe in or anything, I'm just pointing it out, that there's two completely different axioms of where to begin, right? Do you begin with, my view is that the woman, it's her body, so it would be like if she wanted to have her finger amputated or something. It's a dumb analogy, but it's her body. Or is that unborn fetus a separate individual? And you'll see, I mean, abortion has not just become, like, it's still something that people actually argue about, right? Whereas nobody argues for Jim Crow laws. Nobody argues to bring back slavery. Nobody's saying we should roll back gay marriage. And that was very recent too. The gay marriage thing was like, not that long ago, in this century, right?
Yeah. So it's a tough one. I would just say, look, I mean, I would explain it this way. It's a uniquely American phenomenon right now that there's an abortion debate. I think everyone else has moved on. Everyone else has moved on.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy called Roy Epen who was running for the Conservative Party, and he's actually he's pro-life, and we discussed this, and he was very categorical. He said, I don't want to change any laws. I'm fine. I'm a doctor, and I even have recommended women to have abortions as a doctor and as a medical procedure. I'm fine with it, but I myself am in favor of life. I think that a woman, all things being equal, should choose to have the child. Rather, that's just my view, And then as he was describing that, I said to him, "It sounds like your pro-life position sounds like my pro-choice position." Which is sort of interesting, right? But okay, But
just to wrap up, I can zero in on one thing, but it's another can of worms in the can of worms podcast.
We're going to move on in a minute,
but there's a very interesting question: when is the left wrong? Because I'm going to say I'm like a left-wing person. I've been left-wing. My father was left-wing. I'm in a left-wing tradition, and so. What's very interesting to me is I generally think that, in a struggling kind of half-assed, sometimes, complicated way, the left is basically, the hippies were basically right. Freedom is good. Love is good.
You want to know where they're wrong?
Okay, but
economics.
Okay,
that's where they get it.
I want to give you another example. I think the left became questionable during the pandemic, and I'll tell you why. Right. I don't know if the left was wrong or right. I mean, I think the left was much more behind lockdowns, vaccinations.
They were anti-freedom on the lockdown.
Right, and what I just found was when I was really trying to understand what was going on, meaning I wanted to get the science, I wanted to get the interesting opinions and debate, I had to go to right-wing sources. I'm a left-wing guy, and I'm going, how come I'm reading...
You're not the first one to make this comment.
I'm reading this in the National Post, because the left was so cleaved to, like, we must conform to lockdown. Everybody must wear a mask. And it's not that I don't think these things are wrong. I'm generally... At the time, I was pro-vaccine, I was pro-mask. I was but I was never pro-lockdown. I thought lockdown, huge mistake. And I think it's continued to be a mistake. Locking down a civilization is a mistake.
Well, for one thing, it creates this backlash.
Exactly. For that exact reason, it creates a backlash.
People are like, "Whoa, these people. Okay, the left wing people are locking me down. Screw them."
Yeah, that's right. and you'll never do it again. They'll never be
was hardly left wing, and they were, very dictatorial. The problem with the locked. And look. Governments, like any institution, will seek to expand and take over more power. That's just, any individual tries to grow, and institutions try. I mean, I'm part of an institution, right? I'm in a CEGEP. We want more students. We don't want to die, right? So governments, they're power institutions. That's what they do. Their job is to create laws, and then when people break those laws, they impose punishment. They have to do that. So where they can, it seems to me, they will try and expand their power. So I think the governments in Canada that we've seen, like the CAQ and Justin Trudeau, saw this, and in China too, saw this as an opportunity.
It started,
to take over. Yeah,
started in China.
To take over power, to say, okay, well, you need to do this and do that.
It's a really tricky thing. But I think maybe where we would agree was, there was a lack of open discussion.
Yeah.
There's a lack of healthy debate. Like CBC was terrible. There was like one line, you know, and 1.5 line, you know, opinions basically about really drastic things that were taking place. You weren't allowed to challenge or debate it. You fell into one camp or another. You were either like pro-vax or anti-vax when there was actually a multiplicity of takes. And so the result was a kind of like, now we're in sort of a cynical state where nobody trusts anyone because we thought that we found out there was a certain amount of bullshit or a certain amount of thinking on the spot. And
I think people are increasingly cynical because they're realizing that these large institutions, you know, the U.S., the CDC, is that the name of it, right? You know, basically, and the Trudeau government, this has been exposed as well. Basically, we're using this, and that's, I mean, why should we be surprised at that in some sense? Again, back to the expand your power thing.
But let me give you a crazy example for this. I mean, look, I think they really thought, I don't want to, you know, pretend, I don't think the Trudeau government thought, we think this is a fake medical crisis. And they just thought, this is a real medical crisis. This is the best way we're being told to deal with it. And you see that they've always been doing this. Like, you know, medical people have a culture, and this is the way they do things. One of the things that characterizes medical culture is arrogance.
Yeah.
I mean, it just does.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So they were like, we're going to just...
God in a white coat kind of thing.
We're just going to stop. We're going to shut everything down, tell everybody to stay home. At a certain point, it would have been... But here's the other thing. Here's the other context. There's a bunch of other debates about this. If you look at the big picture, climate change, the best thing that could have happened, the very best thing that could have happened to human civilization was a plague that wipes out 2/3 of the population. That would have been the best thing. Then human civilization might have a chance of survival over the next 50, 100 years.
Yeah, well... I hear that thing about the cure being worse than the disease, right? I mean, is that
Anyways, I realized we could go on and on with this.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. I actually don't mind these kind of rabbit holes, but I think that what happened was there's a kind of a problem of expertise being overvalued and also unifocused. Like the politicians, some political leaders have done well with this pandemic. They should bring in medical doctors, listen to them. Bring in psychologists, educators, early childhood education, because you see I see the damage that was done to young people because of the lockdowns. I wrote a whole article about it. I'll send it to you about how after the pandemic, people came in, and I'm still reading essays. I was grading my exams. Students telling me how they started out with like doing Zoom classes and they lost interest and failed and all this stuff. And it's just, of course, and it's like, depression, all that stuff. And you think, and so we were giving these arrogant medicalists, they're like, okay, we're just going to use this one thing as our focus of what we're going to do, and we're going to use that and nothing else. And I think we need a new generation of political people to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore.
If I can just throw something in, it's like, okay, one thing that happened to me is that I was with a group of people when the pandemic started. I said, I actually had a friend who's a doctor in Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, and very early on I asked, where is this going to go? And he said, I think that there's something interesting about going outside. Yeah. And I was like, well, what do you mean? I mean, meaning that this virus probably can't go outside. And I did a bunch of crazy research, fascinating research. Like, why isn't this better? There's a million things I can tell you, not a million. A few things I can tell you, you're going to go, why isn't this better? No. So one thing that's very interesting is if you look into governments for decades were very fascinated in using viruses for biological warfare, because what better way? You drop a virus on your enemy and then they all get it and everybody dies or whatever. Why isn't that used? Why don't you hear about that being used in the Ukraine or places like that? Because it doesn't work that well. You know why it doesn't work that well?
Blows back on you.
Either it blows back on you or there's this other factor. Almost all viruses are immediately eradicated by sunlight. Yeah, sunlight is the enemy of viruses. Now, does this take you to...
That's interesting, yeah. They don't last that long, right? Eventually people go outside and it dies and cough and it just dies in the air.
That's right, it dies in the air, except when you go inside. So here's the other thing. We're now it's fall and we're doing this right now, and there's this weird magical thinking. People are like, isn't it... odd that during the summer, COVID rates are so much lower, and it's pretty okay to hang around with people and find. And then back in winter time, suddenly everybody's getting sick and everybody's getting isolated, and COVID rates are jumping, and
It's
nobody
not
thinks.
odd at all if
Well,
you know. Yeah,
but nobody thinks, well,
sunlight.
yeah, isn't maybe the sun is a factor in this? And there's a bunch of research showing that actually right around now, which is late September, early October, the sun's rays in where we are in this part of the hemisphere become so low you can't derive natural vitamin D. So our vitamin D levels simultaneously, all of us, our vitamin D levels start dropping
So we're outside less often anyway. Even if we are outside, we don't. The sun doesn't actually penetrate into our skin in the way that it's supposed to.
Yes, through the eyes.
I mean, it's quite true that the COVID thing seemed to be worse in northern climates, which shouldn't surprise anybody. It's a flu,
exactly.
Right?
Or and people would say, oh yeah, but look at Peru or places like that. It was almost on the equator. But you know what?
India.
I was just in Lima. I was just in 10 million people live in Lima. Lima is not like a tropical paradise. It's a fucking industrial nightmare.
And they're jammed into probably relatively small dwellings because it's a poor country.
That's
so
right. And
space is more limited, right?
And it's not that warm. It's a pretty cold place. So people are...
Is it mountainous?
When you get into Peru proper, of course, it's the Andes. But Lima is this plateau right next to the ocean that's very industrial and very cold. And they're all crammed in together. And it's actually a good metaphor because Peru has had a big problem with COVID. Like I was just there, everyone's masked. It's still like
they had lockdowns.
They had lockdowns a whole bit, but that's because I blame Lima. Lima had a particular is the perfect place for fostering COVID. If you're up in the Andes, walking around in the sun, healthy, you're not
down on a beach or something.
Yeah, you're not getting it. And I had this experience too, where I went to Mexico at the height of the epidemic. I'm like, nobody's sick. Everybody's out. Everybody's out. They're all out. Yeah. And then when I would tell my Montreal friends, they're like, how dare you? How dare you? I'm like,
how dare you go outside and enjoy your life, right?
Yeah. Don't you this is back to seriousness. There's some important misery going on. Join the misery.
Okay, so speaking of misery, let's that's probably the worst segue ever, but
that's a miserable segue.
Well, the Mohawks were pretty miserable with good reason. What I want to talk about your role, but first I want to just outline to the listeners what I understand about the Oka Crisis and what I remember and what I've cobbled together. There was in Oka, Quebec, which is on the Ottawa River, northeast of the city. There's a nearby reservation reserve called Ganasatake, and they were the city of Oka was going to expand a golf course. And there was a forest in between they were going to cut down or whatever that was also claimed by the indigenous population. I don't know if there are formal treaties. I don't know about that. But
part of the story is that it's a very messy situation where in some places it's very clear where the land is indigenous and where it's not indigenous.
But there it was not.
There was it was like a scattershot.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a claim, and it's not clear if the claim was correct. And I believe that the city of Oka went through some sort of legal process to obtain the land, but I don't know. I think I've read that. So there was a standoff where the natives there, said, well, we're not going to let you in, and then the Sûreté du Québec, and then eventually the Canadian Army, and just quickly to finish it up, the general. This was in 1990. On the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, much closer to Montreal, there's a reserve of Mohawks, also Mohawks, called Ganawage.
Right.
And there's only 4 bridges onto the island of Montreal, one of which is the Mercier Bridge, and they blocked it for a couple of months. So this was the context. This was in the news in 1990. It was huge. It became an international story. The Mohawks, I like to tell people that I really respect the Mohawks because they shoot back. Like it sounds like a very sort of primal thing, but they have these little things left over in these small pieces of land that they've maintained for centuries after, this was mostly their territory back hundreds of years ago. For actually not that long of a period, I've heard from a historian friend they came up from the Hudson Valley at some point around the time the French were arriving, but put that to the side. They do have these claims, and they defend themselves in a real sense. They have weapons, they have guns on the reserve and everything. Now so there was this blockade, at these pines. There was the Sorties du Québec. I don't know if you want to add any details, but you somehow got across these lines. I don't know. I really want to hear your story here.
So let me tell you. So it is like a funny narrative. So I should explain, and then you probably the same thing is that we're old enough now to know that the perception of indigenous people by, let's say, non-indigenous people has changed dramatically.
That's true.
When I was a kid, I remember the
Cowboys and Indians.
Yeah, it was cowboys and Indians, and also there was the stereotype was of this sad,
weak.
And also a drunken Indian. That was the stereotype that we saw presented to us, and it was also a reality. You'd go downtown, and there would often be a drunk indigenous guy there, or something like that. And this was culturally sort of drilled into you, and also that indigenous people were on their way out.
Yeah.
That they were just sort
of a beaten people who are eventually just kind of gone and will eventually be gone. The way the Beothuk no longer exists.
That's right.
Newfoundland, for example.
And it was like a big lie that was very convincing. Yeah. I don't think it was I'm not sure who cooked it up exactly, but it was a kind of, at the same
confluence of circumstances.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it.
To think about it, right?
So just by coincidence, I when I was working as a newspaper reporter at the Montreal Daily News, I get hired to do this side gig where there's a radio station in Kanesatake run by the lovely group of people who...
I listen to it sometimes. 103.7, isn't it?
I think it's... I don't remember what it was at the time, but they...
It's a good station.
They somehow had gotten a grant, or there was a grant affiliated with the radio station to hire people to workshop them because they're technically isolated. So when the teacher asked them, who would you want to teach these workshops, they were like, Albert Nerenberg.
To teach them what exactly?
Well, basically, journalism.
Right,
because at that point I was practicing humorous, comic, bizarro journalism. And that jibed with them. We want bizarro journalism. So every month I would truck up to Kanesatake and I would do a journalism workshop, and I loved the people that were there, and we laughed and we had a great time, and I never thought that much about. I knew they were Mohawk; it was significant to me, but
they're human beings, for Christ's sake. This whole idea that any group of people is somehow going to be different by dint of their racial makeup. It's just, I don't know.
That's weird. Right. To me, there are people that love to laugh and love to look to find the funny side of things.
Yeah.
So what makes a story strange is what you described. So then, at a critical point, the city of Oka wants to expand their golf course literally onto the cemetery, of the Mohawk people and the pines. And so this is a funny thing. At the time, I felt
so they did. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to confirm they did want to actually go into what was a cemetery where there were graves and stones, and they wanted to dig them up or just
move them over or whatever.
Okay,
somehow
that's something where it's like, whoa, that's bad. But the pines are a bit different because the pines, it's sort of like a forest and it's supposed to be sacred. I understand that. I'm not trying to make light of that, but a cemetery should be considered, in my view, especially more important.
A very old cemetery.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to clarify that.
When that happened, they set up a physical blockade. The Mohawks did to stop the construction. They weren't trying to stop the police. They were trying to stop the construction from coming into
that stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, of course, when it's technically illegal, the city of Oka then asked the police to come in. And the police, who are nervous about the Mohawks, come in one day, guns blazing. One of the students...
The Oka police, before the Sorties du Québec.
No, this is the Sorties du Québec. There was a SWAT team. So part of
So sorry to interrupt. They came in almost like a surprise attack? They just kind of they didn't show up and say, hey, clear your things?
I think the reason that it needed to be a big attack is they knew that that Mohawks, some of them were armed,
right?
But that's not that weird. Again, they're indigenous people who hunt, and some of them have guns. But there's also this. We don't have to go into it. The peculiar.
What is wrong with a group of people having guns to hunt or to defend themselves from other people? I don't understand what's wrong with that as a principle. We'll put that to the side for a second.
So, by weird coincidence, one of the people who is at who was actually a key player who's at the blockade when the Sorties du Québec comes in, guns blazing, is a woman named Mary David. Mary David still lives in Kanesatake. She's one of the students of the workshops that I was giving. And so She records the entire thing. It is the only audio recording, and it is a shocking audio recording where you hear her talking about we see the SWAT team arriving.
Were you there?
No, I was not there.
That
She's
recorded.
there.
Okay.
She's there. And she basically records the audio of the machine guns,
Wow.
the guns going off, what sounds like people getting killed. It turns out that's when Corporal LeMay gets killed. But it's like you sense the awfulness of it and the shock of it. And,
so the Canadian Army was already there.
Canadian Army, no. It's
Corporal LeMay. Okay,
Corporal LeMay is from the Silted Quebec.
Okay, pardon me. Okay,
so
I'm confusing it with that famous photograph of the young soldier.
That's later.
Yeah, that's anyone want to listening to this, just Google, the image, and you see this young French Canadian soldier. He's a bit shorter. It's really powerful. Image,
the face-offs. Yeah.
But so she records this basically a surprise attack. They come in. There's a big shootout, and then Corporal LeMay
They make
dies.
a big mistake. The Silted Quebec, I think, make a big mistake because they didn't check the direction of the wind, and they shot tear gas at the Mohawks, but it all came blowing back.
Laughing.
Blowing back on them.
That's something funny and ironic about that. But anyway,
and then
I shouldn't be laughing. It's a very serious matter.
It is very serious. Yeah, it is serious.
There's something ironic about that. But anyway,
the Silted Quebec then abandons the scene and abandons some of their cars. And then you have this, sort of unbelievable scene which unfolds where the Mohawks who know heavy machinery, take the heavy machinery, pile the cars up, and create huge
real blockade
out of police cars. And now it's on. That's when the Oka Crisis really starts. I arrive a little bit later, and I end up when the army comes in, I end up behind the lines with the Mohawks.
I've seen your documentary you made of this. I saw it many years ago. But is it true that you snuck through the lines in the middle of the night? That's what I seem to recall.
Not middle of the night. Not middle of the night. So it's a very risk. So I would say, because this is a podcast a little bit about, the philosophy of stuff. One of the things I've always noticed about life is that the perception of barriers. So if I tell you can't do this or the fence here, people tend to believe in this stuff way too much. And so what happened was when the army came in, they said, we've built the ultimate perimeter. No one will get in, no one will get out. And the reason why they did that is they were trying to keep Canada, the media had played up this idea of the dangerous Mohawk warriors so much that there were different kinds of fear. One of the fears was that the Mohawk warriors would get out and attack Canadians. So the army said, we've created a huge perimeter. No one can get in, no one can get out, where everybody's safe until we negotiate now with the warriors to surrender. So this is a month before the thing ends. So the problem was that the Mohawks, of course, were quite upset, and there was a perception that a shootout could happen and people would die. And weirdly enough, you don't think of television as a civilizing medium because of the nature, because there were live TVs and there were cameras there. The perception was that TV and cameras were keeping the situation safe. Both the Mohawks and the Canadian Army had pledged they would never fire the first shot. So
you don't want to be the one caught on camera firing the first shot.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. But then, listen to what happens. Brian Mulroney at the time is Prime Minister of Canada, and for some reason the CBC decides to pull out the only camera crew that's behind the lines. And this is this big CBC chicken moment where they basically...
Do you know why they made
that
decision? It seems like an odd decision to me from a journalistic perspective. You got people behind the lines, it's gold. I mean, that's really weird. Is there some political interference? Do you think? Is that
young enterprising reporter might want to try to figure this out? It was at that time definitely the government didn't want TV crews in there. I think there was a perception that TV was feeding the crisis. And so...
Just on a side note, I've become less... You mentioned how the CBC has gone down the tubes. I think the CBC has been terrible for many, many years. Yeah. And it's. I mean, you see, in our time, it has almost become a political organ in many respects for the Liberal Party. And here we're seeing it could be political interference. I'm not stating that as a claim, but that seems like a very strange thing to do from a journalistic perspective. Unless I could imagine it in the Balkan War. You had a bunch of journalists and there's guns going off all the time. Okay, pull the reporters out. But was it that dangerous? Or were they feeding it? I sort of suspect that there may have been some political incentive to do that, and the CBC is a political organ. Anyway, that's
I think the most likely story would be that it had become an international event. It was being
making Canada look bad, right?
Right, making Canada look bad. It was being driven by media, and it was being driven by imagery, powerful images of defiant Mohawks, literally with Mohawks.
That's great.
Saying "up yours" to the Canadian government. So
it was seen as a kind of like, you've taken our land. We used to be the stewards or the owners of most of this territory hundreds of years ago, and bit by bit, our reserves have been chipped away at, over centuries, and that's actually on the record. I mean, Ganawage used to be like half of the South Shore or something. It was enormous, and now it's still pretty big, but it's much smaller. And it was sort of like, okay, enough. That was the sense I remember at the time. Like this is where we're stopping that process.
But one thing I want to say, well, exactly, and not only that, and when you say enough. The reason why Oka is so important, probably like if you're a young person, you're probably tired of hearing about it. I mean, it's why
if you're a young person, you may never have heard of it.
That too.
Many of my students have probably don't know very much about it, if anything.
But it was revolutionary for the indigenous peoples of North America, and I think for this very weird reason, it's the way it has to do with pop culture. It suddenly cast Native and indigenous people in an empowered way. They were
standing up for themselves, shooting back, not shooting necessarily, but just threatening to,
and talking back, and it was sort of that defiant and powerful state.
I've read, maybe you can confirm this, but I've read that the Mohawks have a long history of doing this. I read that in the 70s there was a standoff at Akwesasne, which is a reserve on the St. Lawrence at Cornwall, partly in Ontario, Quebec, and New York, and they shot down a New York State Police helicopter. This was, I don't know what was happening. It was some sort of a thing that happened, but I read that once. I remember thinking, wow, and no one ever heard of that. So that tells you that there was something about this moment that happened at Kanesatake and Ganawage, right? Because this thing, I mean, again, someone would have to fact check me on the New York State Police thing.
I wasn't sure it was a helicopter, but there was definitely a shootout in Akwesasne.
And it was prior to. So there was something, and it's not nearly as well known as the Oka Crisis. So there was something about that moment in 1990 that exploded it onto the world stage.
If you want context, though, also, too, you want to go back to Wounded Knee. Because Wounded Knee was the huge uprising in South Dakota, which had a very similar thing. The parallels were very strong. There was about 80 people, indigenous Sioux, I believe, who were behind the lines, surrounded by FBI and military, I believe. But the difference is that Wounded Knee, almost everybody who was there died. They either got shot, but they weren't necessarily.
It's a long time before, though. To the 70s.
That's right, 70s.
70s, so 10 or 15 years, but prior to it.
It was seen as about a tragic thing, meaning there was a Native uprising, but it ended badly for everyone, and it wasn't a source of, complicated. For some people, maybe it wasn't a source of pride. But then you also have this famous speech that's made at the Academy Awards, where Marlon
Brando refused to.
He
refused to accept the award, and he sent up a Dakota Indian or Native person to accept not to accept it, but to take it in his stead something like that.
So so at that time, the tide is still turned against Indigenous people, but when Oka happens, you have this amazing reversal where suddenly people are much more pro-Indigenous.
There's also the differences between the United States and Canada in that Indigenous issues are much more important in Canada because much of our territories in very, very remote areas that are at least technically have land claims by Indigenous populations, whereas the United States, there's not that much of the country that is still.
It's funny,
you know what I mean? Like, and also it's a larger percentage of our population. I think it's about 3 or 4% of Canada's population is in the U.S. It must be less than that, right? So
it's funny. I think you're right. I think it's the nature of Canadian wildness too. I heard a guy on the radio the other day saying something funny, which is he said that people talk about the terrors of how terrible residential school was, and he said, I completely avoided residential school because what people don't realize is that there are Indigenous groups that are so off the beaten path or so far away from highways and roads. The RCMP and the missionaries couldn't get in to take away our kids.
Thompson Highway talked about how he was born in a snowbank, and literally in northern Manitoba, and how speaking of being off the beaten track, and his father wanted him to go to a residential school because all of his brothers and sisters couldn't read or write, and his father thought maybe my youngest son can learn, So it's I think it's hard for people to understand that up until very recent memory, there still were indigenous populations living in at least a semi-traditional way, probably certainly using technology like guns, but moving around and hunting, and that, I'm guessing that's not really the case in most cases now. But just again, back to the importance of the indigenous population relative to the general population is higher in Canada than it is in the United States. So that plays into Oka again, I think, as well.
So,
right.
So when Oka happened, so maybe I think you'd ask me to explain how
you got through the lines.
Yeah. So basically, what happens is the Canadian Army creates this perimeter. They advertise it; nobody can get in or out. And at that point, I am working as a reporter covering it as a columnist for the Montreal Gazette. And what happened at this critical moment is the military sort of really clamped down. And you couldn't do anything. As a reporter, you're intensely frustrated because before you could talk to the Mohawks, you could approach different people and find out like their angle on the story. All of a sudden, everything is only military press releases or press conference. So the military would come along and they'd say, very boring things. They would just say nothing happened on the perimeter today because of our fantastic perimeter, and that would be basically it. That would be your report. And so
that's funny. Yeah.
So, but when the CBC pulled out their crew, we had a motive, which is everyone had been saying up to this point was keeping it safe. Is the TV cameras are keeping everything that happened because there's a record of who would shoot first, and there was a real concern that there was going to be like a kind of low-level,
I remember that
war.
sense. I remember my mom being very concerned it was going to be basically a kind of a very violent outcome. It was lucky it didn't turn into that.
And also there were these practical considerations. The armored personnel carriers of the Canadian Army, which had 50 caliber guns on them, were lined up along the highway facing Hudson. So if you had a shootout...
why were they facing Hudson?
Because Hudson is on the other side.
Okay, so the bullets could stray across. I understand, right? It could shoot right through, and then some poor kid in Hudson walking down the street might get hit by a stray bullet or something.
So there was it could have gotten very messy.
Wow. That's right, because it's just across the river. That's right. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm just thinking of the geography again. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so the CBC pulls out the Canadian Army's putting these anodyne press releases out that are total, PR
and we're
basically
nonsense. Right. All the reporters are intensely frustrated because we can't do our jobs. And there's a press conference. So the military calls a press conference at the top of Highway 344. Basically, they're saying the same things usual. Nothing much has happened. The perimeter is fantastic.
Nothing to see here. Move along. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So myself and Robert Galbraith, who's a photographer who I've often worked with, and we're always, we're up to shenanigans. We think, okay, let's see if we can. Well, actually, there's a bit more to the story. I go for lunch right before the press conference, and I happen to have a little video camera with me, and I meet this guy from TVA, Alain Pelletier, and he says to me, if you can get that camera in, we'll hire you right away. And at that time, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And everyone's frustrated because there's no video coming from inside. So this is over poutine, like in a
Belle Province or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
I think I've been to that one. I've driven Uber up there a fair bit in that part of the St. Eustache and all that. So I know the area a little bit. But okay, so you're having a poutine with him, and he says, "Hey, if you can get me some video, then we'll get you we'll hire you basically."
And it's a weird intersection of my two parts of my life because the only reason I have a video camera is because I'm in an improv troupe. Right. And the problem with the improv troupe is like when you do improv, your show is great, but it disappears. Nobody remembers. Like you say, "Hey, remember we did that great show?" Yeah. But it's all gone because it's improv.
So you want to film them?
You film it just to keep a record that it was like, that was a good show. Yeah. And so I have a video camera, and we have this conversation. So next thing we know, we're up at the Highway 344. The perimeter's over there. The military giving this press conference, and Robert Galbraith and I say, okay, let's go for it. Let's see if we can get in.
This is daytime.
This is daytime.
Broad daylight.
It's broad daylight. So we do this trick. It's a Boy Scout trick. Basically, the press conference is there. We're just sitting on the grass, and there's a hill, maybe that's about 100 yards high before there's the forest, which is like, it's because the highway has a ravine on either side of it.
Okay.
So what we do is because we're sitting there and there's really sentries everywhere. They can see you.
Yeah.
We just start pushing our feet very slowly. So if you'd been watching us, you'd be saying, wait a second, weren't those guys...
But they weren't focused attention on you.
Right. So it's just like...
by that tree and now they're by this other tree?
Exactly.
Like, what?
It's happening very slowly.
Wow.
So we get to the very top of the ravine after like 20 minutes probably, and the press conference is still going on, blah, 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 nothing's happening on the perimeter. Now we're at the edge of the forest. We look around, we check at all the sentries. What are they looking? They're all watching the press conference.
Wow.
Because the only thing that's happening. So at a sudden moment, we go 1, 2, 3, and we jump in the forest. But now,
so when they turned around, they must have noticed, oh, what happened to those guys? Or they didn't, or maybe
didn't.
They were... Also, they might have turned around and thought, maybe I was imagining that.
Exactly. The press was able to move in and out because we're all outside the perimeter. So there's no limits at that point on too much movement.
So let me just recap what you just said. You sat down at the bottom of the ravine with your photographer friend.
Yeah.
And you sat cross-legged and just sort of pushed your way up the hill
very
slowly backwards.
Inch by inch.
Inch by inch until you were up at the tree line at the top of the hill.
Exactly.
And in the meantime, there's a blah, blah, blah press conference going on, and there's like this, the sentries are all kind of, maybe they're smoking or whatever they're doing, and they're kind of like, they're not paying that much attention to what's going on over there. They're assuming that things are cool because they're there.
Yeah.
Right? They're not thinking. And so you're at the tree line, and then at a moment you're like, okay, 1, 2, 3. You just stood up and ran into the woods.
That's right.
That is just wild.
Okay, but it actually gets weirder. So then basically what we start doing is we know the area, so we know we're going to go straight to where the Mohawks are. But so we start very, very slowly crawling, but we know that they have military. What I was surprised about military culture is a lot of interesting sneakiness. So one of the things they do is they make traps all over the place.
Well, it's kind of their job, isn't it? If you're the army, right? I mean, I don't know. More about. I mean, it's like if you're going to win a war, you have to.
Yeah,
it's sort of like it's kind of like a street fight. Is it unfair to kick a guy in the nuts? Well, you're street fighting, right? So military. I mean, I'm not saying this is nice of them to do. I'm just saying their job. They were sent in by the Canadian government to say there's a situation going on here. We need you to, just to steelman their view. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So there's booby traps.
Booby traps everywhere.
Yeah.
So but it was funny. We had to go very slowly. We basically would walk along, and sometimes we crawled along, and then you would see
a line,
like a fishing line across.
So and what would that? Do you know what that would set off?
It set off a phosphor bomb, which is huge. Huge. It wouldn't blow you up, but it would be a massive white light that everybody would see.
Okay, so the objective is not to kill the person who sets it up, but to identify there's an intruder at that point. Exactly. I see like a flare going up, like smoke going up. Yeah, I got you. Okay.
So we would
carefully crawling along, identifying them, stepping over them carefully or under them. I don't know.
Just think over them, and also there were soldiers everywhere. There were sentries in the forest. The forest was full of soldiers, but we're crawling along. One of the funniest parts of it, I just remember very correctly, is that we went behind. We knew there was sentries coming, so we went behind a giant rotting log. Myself and Robert Galbraith, and this is late. This is our late summer, August. And in August in Canada. Yeah. Big spiders. That's especially by the river. Big water spiders. I remember we're crawling ourselves, we're sneaking under the log. I'm looking at Robert's face. There's literally giant spiders crawling all over his face, and we're like, shh, because we can hear them sentries.
This is like a scene in a movie. I'm picturing it like in a movie with okay, you can. You're just like biting your tongue.
It's just so weird to see your friend's face covered in spiders. Anyway,
it takes some balls. I got to congratulate you and your friend. Once we were in.
Like once we were doing it, we were doing it. It gets weirder. Then, as we're going along, we realize a point where we're not exactly sure if we're following the right route. We get to a certain point, and we know that there are soldiers coming. So down there, we can see the back of somebody's house with a above ground pool.
Okay.
So literally what we do is we're like, shit, somebody's coming. Let's go. We go down to
the pool.
We go hide. We go by the above ground pool, and we hear The soldiers come out of the forest. They can hear us. They know we're there.
Okay.
So
that they had kind of spotted you, like auditorily. They could hear you and like, okay, there's intruders.
There's something going on. I think they were just checking it out. Right. So it was a very Charlie Chaplin kind of scene because
Keystone Cops.
Because what they did is we heard them come and look around the pool, but it's a circular pool.
Oh my God!
So we go a little bit like
going
this.
Around.
Yeah, and they go like that. So we go like this, and then we go the other way.
They hear you sort of scurrying behind, or
they must have heard something.
They might have thought they were kids from the house,
or
too,
rabbits,
or some animal, a dog or something.
So eventually, we see and hear them walk away.
That is so wild. I'm just I have that image in my head of kind of the soldiers coming into the yard. And then going like this, and sort of you scurrying around the other side, and then them going the other way, and wow. So that's, I mean, just to put a final loop on that, if you had scurried the wrong way, they would have caught you.
Yeah.
And then they would have held a gun to you saying, stand up, put your hands up, and you would have had no choice but to comply.
That's right.
Or else they would have shot you, most likely, right?
That's right.
I don't know if they would have shot you.
That actually, anyway. Weirdly, I'd had the experience before. A few nights before, a bunch of us had gone over the perimeter when and literally they had put a gun against my chest.
Wow.
But it was like it's a kind of a manageable situation. You apologize and say, I know you guys are just doing your job, and it was okay. They were
These are Canadian Army soldiers.
They're reasonable.
What were they like? Were they like mostly young French Canadian guys?
Unfortunately, surprisingly young, like 17, 18 often, maybe 19.
French Canadians, mostly from Long Point, or I'm just curious about like
Valcourt. From all around
or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, that's a side note. So you get to the pool, you do the scurrying, and then the soldiers lose interest and they go away. So you go back.
We go back up into the forest, and then when we go back up into the forest, we eventually arrive at the famous perimeter, which is a huge observation tower. So the army has built like these 150-foot towers so they can observe everything with searchlights and everything like that. And what appears to be a 15-foot razor wire fence that's all the way around where the Mohawks are. So,
wow.
I am basically kind of, at that point, we get a little bit demoralized. We're like, I don't know how we're going to get over the razor wire, because of razor wire, I don't know if you've ever experienced it, razor wire is designed so that if you slide against it, it has these hooks that will hook into your flesh or hook into your clothes. The idea is so you can't get over it quickly, and
well, it's also you could die because there are literal razors.
I don't think it would kill you. Yeah, definitely you'll get little cuts all over you. Yeah, that would cause you to bleed, and it's a kind of bad news.
Yeah.
So we're looking at the fence and we're going like, how are we going to climb this fence? Also without being seen, because by definition the perimeter is being watched. So we look at it for a second. We look at it, and then we go, wait a second. Maybe we don't need to go over the fence. Maybe we can just go under the fence.
Digging?
We didn't even have to dig. We took our jackets off. And all we did is we stuck our jackets under the razor wire. We lifted them up.
Yeah.
Robert rolls through, and then I roll through, and we pull our jackets off, and we were in.
Wow.
We were in, and it took us 3 seconds.
So the bottom of the fence was not sort of nailed down to the ground. It was just ground there.
Like, I guess they didn't think of it that way.
Do that, yeah.
They sort of thought because it's against an advancing military force trying to come through or something like that. So we just went right in. Next thing we know, we're in, and then we went straight into the Mohawk forest. And the funniest part of it was, like, the Mohawks also didn't know that we were there. So the military at no point saw us.
They might think that that's dangerous.
That's what happened. Right. All of a sudden, they saw us, and we were surrounded by 15 Mohawk women that had baseball bats.
Oh, my God.
And it was just this weird coincidence that the moment where we arrived, the Mohawk warriors were having a meeting, and they exchanged places so that the women were on the perimeter and the men were in the meeting. And so they were like, and we almost got our heads batted, except that they recognized us. They said, are you
press? I mean, you play the press card.
Yeah, we had our press cards,
and they were like, with the media here.
But they also believed it was impossible to get in unless you had been let in by the military.
Right. So they suspected that you were somehow, double agents or spies or something like that, which is a reasonable suspicion, I think, on their part. Right?
Yeah, it was reasonable.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, it's, again, back to the dirty nature of war, right?
Yeah.
You figure out, ways to... So you pull out your press cards and say it's okay, and then they're suspicious of you.
But then they sit us down, we tell them the whole story, how we got through, And
they believe you.
I believe it, and we also show them that we have a camera,
right?
And the camera is like this weird moment. It's like gold. This is before there were,
no phones everywhere.
Yeah. So it's like they're like, oh, you have a camera, all right.
So you can actually record things and prove that we're not doing anything.
And it shows that they had there was some righteousness to their side. They said the Mohawks wanted everything to be witnessed, good and bad. The police and the army, not so much.
Less transparency.
Yeah.
Right. So they wanted things to be transparent. They were willing to be filmed and say, look, this is what we're doing. Yeah. We're trying to defend our lands. That's blah, blah, blah. If something, we're not going to shoot first unless we're shot at, blah, 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 which is, it's an incoherent statement. But anyway, so you managed to prove to them that you're okay, and they're happy with the camera, so they bring you in, and then then you make the movie, which I think as I recall.
There's two movies. This was interesting. There's two movies because people often there's a movie called Ganastage 270 years.
I think I've seen that one.
Of resistance.
Yeah,
that was by the NFB, and that's where they show this funny thing because in the movie they interview the army. So when we first went through, the army adamantly denied. Remember the press conference I was talking about? They're like, no one got through our perimeter. And not only that, they were like, it's totally fucking impossible to get through our perimeter. No one got through. And then because we had shot footage, the NFB then shows footage of us inside. Wow. And we're like, hi!
We're inside the perimeter and we snuck through.
Right, yeah. So it's a very weird moment in the film where the military, unfortunately, is caught up being completely wrong. And they're also so confident. They're like, arrogant. I can tell you without the least doubt that no one at all ever got through a perimeter. Our perimeter is impenetrable.
Which as soon as you expose your presence turns from confidence to arrogance or maybe deflated. I don't know.
It becomes comic because actually the clip is in the film where I say, I would recommend visiting Oka to anyone. It's really relaxing and beautiful. It's like a tourist thing,
That is great, man. Nice. Okay, that is such an incredible story. So I just wonder, I mean, we're moving towards closing here, I think. But I just wonder if you had any other observations about that experience, because it's such an
maybe to make sense, to help make sense. Cause, I mean, whenever I do these things, I'm sort of like trying to make sense of my life, my weird life. But there is some weird... So let me tell you the end of the story. So part of the end of the story is that after I'm inside, myself and Robert are with the Mohawks for this last sort of 3.5 weeks. It's quite a crazy experience. We set off phosphor bombs. There's some near shootings. Some bad things happen. But at the very, very end, one of the weird things that happens is the Mohawks basically put their guns into a giant bonfire. They have beaten Wounded Knee in terms of the longest indigenous standoff. They're now ready to leave on their own terms. They walk out across the Razorwire. They put a fence over the Razorwire. They crush it down. And they walk out. But what happens is there's basically a physical confrontation on Highway 344. It's dusk. The military. I filmed the whole thing. That's when one Mohawk gets stabbed by a bayonet. But there's a lot of violence. But it's, I mean, all things considered, maybe it's not that bad. That's my take on it.
I think my impression has always been it could have been
far worse.
It could have been basically a war.
Or you could have had like 11 people shot or something like that. Yeah. So there is some violence, but it's tempered. And I myself, at that point...
So just sorry to interrupt, but you witnessed that when they went out? Yeah, and you filmed it.
It's a very powerful scene in the documentary I made called O Canada, spelled O-K-A Nada, O Canada. So you'll see the end and the footage, and the reason it's not more famous, the irony, the twist of this, even though that the whole reasons we went in there is because the CBC chickened out and pulled out their camera crew. That's why we went in. The CBC, when we finished the documentary, they say, we're sad to tell you that this does not reach our journalistic standards. And we wanted to write them back and say, your journalistic standards of cowardice.
Yeah. People can't see me, but I'm shaking my head at just that, that's like your whole job as a journalist. I guess I shouldn't be too hard. It must be, I don't know whether they had their reasons. I'm trying not to be too judgmental.
In Canada, you have gatekeeper culture. So
they can just way to think about it. Right?
They can just decide because they're the gatekeepers. But anyway,
the CBC are the ultimate. Yeah. But anyway, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
So long story short, when I get out. Some people, the military pledges, like there were some negotiations that went on, And some of the concerns was that the Mohawks did not want to get arrested by the Sûreté de Québec because they knew that the Sûreté de Québec had been beating people up and might kill people or hurt them or whatever. There was any, so
they trusted the Canadian Army more than the
way more
Quebec provincial police, just in English, if anybody doesn't.
Yeah, at that time the police also had a certain reputation, and so
they've always had a reputation.
Yeah,
the Sûreté de Québec going back a long time.
So it's a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. Yeah, that we're not going to touch. So in other words, the Mohawks say if we are going to surrender, we would like to surrender to the Canadian Army rather than the Sûreté.
That's the deal. And also the press was in on it too, because the press also felt that the Sûreté was hostile because a number of press people had been beaten up. I mean, Robert Galbraith.
By the SQ?
Yeah, had a revolver stuck into his ear. Let me explain the details of it. It's not that they put a revolver against his head.
Put it in his ear.
They put it in his inner ear and pushed. So it was like a cold. Imagine that feeling, where there's a cold feeling in your.
That's a torture tactic, obviously, and the gun's loaded. I'm presuming,
of course,
right?
I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
So even if it isn't, you have to imagine that it is in that moment, right? Or else it's the consequences are.
So we knew that it would be bad to be grabbed by the Sûreté, and so we had negotiated an arrangement that the reporters would be taken into military custody. And so that's what happens when the whole thing ends as chaos and things that the military literally physically grabbed by soldiers. The soldiers detain us, and they are able to put away. And then there's this weird moment, a terrible moment for me, where they say, "Except Nerenberg." And they're like, I'm like, what? What?
So everybody can go except you?
Not go, but at least so they're all taken away into military custody. All the other reporters and Mohawks,
except
Nerenberg. And I'm like, what? What do you mean except Nerenberg? And so they're like, no,
and you're the only Nerenberg there.
It turns out that the police had a reason to separate me, which was that because we had snuck through and had caused such a hullabaloo, it was technically considered, or they had charged me with trespassing.
Oh my God!
So they were able to sort of say, we have to deal with this guy. He's not being a journalist; he's a trespasser, and
they want to make an example of you.
Or they were using any excuse to be able to grab anybody because the military was keeping everybody from the SQ.
Can I ask a quick technical question about that? If you're trespassing on the Mohawk land, wouldn't the Mohawks have to be the ones to accuse you of trespassing?
Who knows? But also it was the military perimeter. Right. There's a whole bunch of
anyway, that's too technical for this. But anyway, so they keep you behind, and what they explain this to you.
So then what happens to me is I get taken away by the SQ, and the SQ are not dressed as SQ. I see these guys who are dressed in military combat uniforms. A little part of the story is that the SQ deliberately put on their military outfits so that nobody would know who they were. They're not wearing badges. They're not looking like SQ. They also even
shades of Russians in Ukraine, and up until the invasion, there were these sort of dual green men walking around with no Russian flags on their uniforms.
Same. I guess it's an old trick that, and so this is. I got to say, it's a fairly terrifying moment for me. So next thing I know, I'm thrown into a police car. My head is bashed against the top of the car. I don't know if you know this, but this is like an old trick. If you're a cop and you want to kind of rough people up in a way that is like kind of doable, what you do is you just smash their head against the rim of the doorway.
As they're going into the car.
Yeah, because it's just an easy thing to do. It's easy to do. You're just like, hey.
Well, it's almost a stereotype to be like, watch your head or whatever. Like Jerry Seinfeld had a whole routine about it. You know, it's like, but you're saying is if no one's watching, they shove you in the car.
Yeah, they smash your head. And then.
So that disorients you. You're in the back of the car. You're kind of stunned.
Then next thing I know, I'm in the car with these crazy, angry Quebecois cops who start calling me. They're a Mohawk. They say you're a Mohawk, and I'm like,
but you're not.
Yeah, anyway. I'm not Mohawk.
Even if you were, what's the problem with that? But anyway, yeah.
So I also said I actually tell them. So finally, they drive me.
No, tell them you're a Jew. That's going to help.
Even worse. So
I'm not Mohawk. I'm Jewish. You know, like, what? That going to help?
They drive me somewhere into the middle of a forest, and I gotta say,
wow,
it was a very interesting moment for me. I didn't know what was possible at that moment. I thought maybe this is where I die, and because I knew that these were very angry people with guns, and so next thing I know, they take me out of the police car. I'm handcuffed, And there's a very funny, so an interesting thing happens. These 4 cops show up. They're not dressed as cops. They're in full military gear, but I know that they're not.
They're not Canadian Army. You know they're SQ.
They're
right?
SQ.
Yeah. Okay.
Particularly, here's the joke, because one of them was enormously fat, and so it comes up later.
No soldier would be that fat, right?
It's illegal to be that fat.
Yeah,
and
that's funny.
So they surround me.
Donuts or whatever, right? Yeah.
At this point, I know that I've got to say something because it's going to get bad. So the only thing I can say to them is, I'm working for the Montreal Gazette, which is actually a bad thing to say because they hate the Montreal Gazette. Because I don't know if you remember the time Aislinn had done a cartoon, which would famously the SQ had hated. I think it was like an incredibly offensive cartoon, which made them even more pissed off.
Okay.
So when I say,
I don't recall. So, wow.
Yeah. So I say I'm from the Montreal Gazette. And I'm actually
also you're an Anglo too. I mean, we have to be honest about that. You being an Anglo doesn't help. If you, I mean, I don't mean to accuse French Canadians of being bigoted necessarily, but in this heated context, those things kind of mixing together. The Gazette, that you're also Jewish as well, right? I mean,
but no, okay. The only thing I'm speaking in French. My French is not that bad.
Yeah.
So I introduce.
But you have an accent.
Yeah, I probably have an accent.
Yeah,
I say
right,
I actually say I'm working for the Montreal Gazette and TVA because at that point I was working for at that time was the top Quebecois network, the TVA.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So I say I'm working for the Montreal Gazette, but before I can finish a sentence, the big guy winds up and punches me in the face. That's a bad. I remember thinking, you know how your brain works. I'm like, I think this is bad,
right?
Because like nobody knows I'm here. All these people have guns. They're incognito, and they hate me.
That reminds me of that Mike Tyson line. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. It's like you literally experienced that. Like, whoa! Now whatever your plan was with your journalism. Yeah. Well, okay, now I got to go to whatever other plan I could go to or whatever. Right. So he punches you in the face.
But there's something funny that happens here. I don't know if you at that time I wear nerd glasses. People used to the Mohawks called me Buddy Holly because I looked.
I remember those glasses.
Yeah. And so when the guy punches
you wearing those,
this weird magical thing. So I think there's magic in my life. Sometimes I think there's magic in my life because when he punches me in the face, my glasses fly off so quickly that they hit a bunch of other people. So like the nerd glasses, you see these nerd glasses hit that guy's face and then that guy's shoulder, and then they fly and they land on the ground. Wild. And then you know what's weird? The nerd glasses like land on the ground like this, and it's like they're looking at us. Like it's like.
So everybody looks over at them, and it's like these two eyes.
Yeah,
everybody sees that. You can sense. Everyone senses that.
Yeah,
right?
That's what happens. Yeah. So I've just been punched, but I luckily didn't like connect that hard, and so I didn't fall over or anything.
So it wasn't a super hard punch.
I think it was hard, but just didn't properly connect, and it hit the glasses more than it hit me. Right. And then, so I just could have kindly reached down and I pick up my glasses with my handcuffs on, actually, and I kind of screwily put them back on.
So you were cuffed in front. I was actually wondering about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
You must have been if you were able to put the glasses.
I'm trying to remember how I was able to get the glasses back on.
Because if you're cuffed behind, it wouldn't be possible. Right?
I was just trying to be polite, but then there's this weird moment. I don't know. They say there's a weird pause, and I think because of the glasses flying around hitting everybody, if you want to get violent with people, you need a bit of back and forth, right? So the guy basically punches me. An absurd moment ensues,
and you're not defending yourself
because I'm handcuffed, right? Because I can't punch the guy back,
right?
And so there's just this awkward moment. And I'm thank God for awkward moments. Because instead what they do is they go, okay, you fucking asshole, in French probably. Yeah. They just push me back into the police car, drive me at high speeds to the police station. I think San Eustache police station. They do threaten me as when I go. And what they did is when I arrived at the police station, I remember it was not fun either. Because I basically am paraded by a bunch of sentries, cops, all of whom, as I walk by, look me in the eye and grab their revolvers, as if to say, if I could, I would just shoot you in the face. That's what they were saying.
That's a life-changing experience.
Yeah, but there's a reason why I'm telling you this story, because then I end up in the cell. More things happen. Lasagna's down. Other Mohawk warriors are also in the same cell. I hear people getting beaten up.
Wow.
And it's not a pleasant sound. And then they come around to me, and a guy... the same guy who punched me comes back opens the cell and kicks me, spits on me, does a bunch of stuff. I can't remember. I just keep reminding them that I am media,
Right. Yeah.
which doesn't seem that helpful. But I think in the end it was.
It probably did.
Yeah.
Because they're probably as they're angry. The other part of their brain is going, "Whoa! If I go too hard on this guy, he may get my badge number. I could be exposed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So eventually, make a long story short, eventually I am in the morning. They drive me to the Parthenay prison. They put me in Parthenay.
Back when it's actually the SQ headquarters.
It was the SQ
in Montreal. So they drive
right.
you all the way to Montreal. Parthenay Street near the Jacques Cartier Bridge. There's a black building. Those are listeners who know Montreal, and it's got a big Sûreté du Québec logo up at the top, and it's also a prison as well, right? That's what I've heard. I've heard it's both.
The upper floors were a prison,
right?
And
I think it used to be only a prison, and then the SQ moved in, as I recall. But anyway, that's a side note. Okay, so they put you in there,
and eventually, suddenly, out of the blue, like I just kept feeling like everything was escalating, but suddenly, I don't know, at about 7 a.m., they said, okay, they brought me downstairs, and they basically said, remember the guy said, "Get the fuck out of here," or something along the lines of, just fuck off.
Yeah, right,
and
so you stumble out into the morning, and it's morning, and it's sunny. That must have been you must remember that. It must have been intoxicating to be free.
Yes.
Just seeing the bridge or whatever you were looking at, I can just imagine.
It was intoxicating. But the reason I tell this story is this, of course, I developed PTSD. For years, I had dreams of these things replaying in my head. The guys looking at me holding their revolvers, the punch in the face, the kicking inside the cell. So I replayed it all, and the reason why this I think this is a good place probably for us to end, but I'll tell you where the end of the story goes is that years later, so the PTSD gradually went away, but part of what made it go away is I moved out of Montreal. I went and I moved to Toronto.
Yeah.
I had to get out of town. Every time I saw a cop car, like I'd be with
I was thinking every time you see an SQ or go by the building at Parthenay, or if you're in St. Eustache or something, like, whoa,
It was weird. It was any cop car. I would just be in downtown Montreal with my hipster friends or whatever, and any cop car driving by, my heart would start beating. I would suddenly start sweating. It was classic PTSD symptoms. And it just made my life less fun. And
so you decided to leave and go to Toronto.
It was one of the things. I mean, I think it was also the time where Montreal was kind of down in the dumps. So it was a good time to kind of get out. But where this takes me is that years later, I'm assigned to do a documentary for Vision TV in Toronto. And the documentary is about people who dreamt about 9/11 before it happened. It's a crazy, weird documentary. Make a long story short, it's a really weird experience because I have to go into recreations of 9/11, the way people died, the way people dreamt about it, and how weird this whole thing is. And I get deeply traumatized by the experience because I keep seeing imagery of people dying in 9/11, which is something that a lot of people went through, but I'm seeing it over and over again, part of making this film. And so I developed full-blown PTSD. I now have high anxiety.
Wow.
I now have a lot of stress and worry in my life. And I'm just not a happy person because of the PTSD. Make a long story short, one day I'm on the internet and I see this little ad that says, "Do you ever have obsessive memories that you can't get out of your head, like weird things?" And I'm like, "Hey, that's me." And I have like a free hour or something like that, and it's like a phone number there. And I thought, call this number for free, and I'll show you something interesting. For some reason, I'm not normally wouldn't do, but I realized that's me. I call the number. This guy gets on the line, says, "I'd like to try something on you if this is okay. You can explain your story a little bit." I explain, I have these pictures I can't get out of my head. And then he runs a protocol on me.
Over the phone?
Over the phone.
Wow.
Later, I find out at the end of the whole experience that it was hypnosis. But the amazing thing that happens in half an hour, this terrible trauma, this picture, that movie of people dying that I cannot get out of my head goes away. I mean, I still have the picture, but I stop being traumatized. And then I feel this cloud lift over my life where I suddenly feel way better and my PTSD starts to go away. And that leads me to go, what the hell was that?
Hypnosis.
Yeah, and then a few years later, I get an opportunity to get trained in hypnosis. I realized hypnosis is like this wild, crazy thing. I start figuring out like that. How come most of the culture doesn't know about this? Because it fixed my PTSD. Excuse me. I had very bad PTSD. It fixed it.
So it has applications that maybe are not like for people who are suffering, is what you're saying, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But and it was so quick. Like it really happened in half an hour in my case. And I think so the weird part of the story is I learn hypnosis, I get trained as a hypnotherapist. I also discover that most of the world culturally does not understand hypnosis. And then I realize that, holy cow, there's some aspects of hypnosis are very mind-blowing. Fast forward a few years later, I'm at Queen's University. They are doing auditions for their TEDx, and I decided, maybe I'll try this out. So I auditioned to TEDx. The committee is there, and I say, would you guys like to try some hypnosis? They're all hypnotizable. They get completely hypnotized.
Wow.
And I demonstrate to them sort of some of the amazing things. And right there, they say, everyone else, they say, we'll call you back. They say, you're in. Make a long story short, I do this TEDx for Queens. This is now, I don't know.
Is that available? Can people go and get that on YouTube?
Look up.
Yeah.
Look up.
Albert Nerenberg TEDx, hypnosis, something like that on YouTube.
Fake?
Yeah.
Just to
is
tell
hypnosis fake? Right.
The whole thing, that video went viral. That TEDx now has 11 million views. It is the most watched demonstration of hypnosis possibly in human history. Even though I'm not going to say it's the greatest demonstration of hypnosis, but it is because of the way it went viral.
Congratulations.
Part of this, the reason I'm telling the story is like it's a weird. It like what I'm saying is that life takes you to interesting places, and if I had not been punched in the face at Oka and then led to other trauma and then gone on a healing path to sort of solve my problems, I would have never made that TEDx. And also that TEDx has resulted in some of the popularization of hypnosis, hopefully for healing people in very effective ways.
Maybe it's had a positive effect. I want to ask a closing question because I like to end on a positive note, and I'm going to take a risk in a minute. But the first thing I would ask you is, have you seen any revenue from those 11 million downloads? I mean, do you get anything from that? I'm just curious.
In this particular case,
it's just sort of your name being out there.
But also TEDx owns the rights, not me. But but it was a fantastic thing. I've done.
No, I'm not making it. I'm just curious if you've been able to see, because 11 million YouTube clicks might be like, I don't know, $100 or something.
Yeah, that's right.
What I understand about how YouTube works, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But what I want to get to close is that, I like to tell my students that, we talk a lot. I teach this course called English Language and Culture, so we do language stuff. It's at an advanced level, but we also do the culture. So we look at movies and TV shows and also the origins of the English-speaking world, including Canada. And I like to sort of tell them basically that you're lucky to be born in this country, and this is a good country, generally speaking, whether it's Canada or Quebec. First of all, do you agree with that? And because you might not, do you think that that there's anything we could say in that direction, even with all these experiences with the Canadian Army apparently acting in a really negative way and the Sûreté du Québec? I'm wondering, does the treatment of the Aboriginal population more generally, and that particular case, what does that say about us saying that Canada's a good country and we're proud to be Canadians? And is there anything positive there? I hope there is.
I think the answer is yes, there is. Let me explain what it is. Is that, again, if you compare Wounded Knee to Oka, Wounded Knee almost... So there was a point during the Oka Crisis where some of the people, the leaders, sat us down and said, at Wounded Knee, almost no one survived. Keep that in mind.
So get ready.
Get ready, exactly. And I remember that was not a pleasant speech.
It's basically saying you might get shot in a couple of days or whatever when we go out. Yeah.
Because the perception, you know why? There's a very simple reason, logic to it. The lands of North America are contested. They arguably, most of them belong to indigenous
people. That's the heart of my question is the Canadian state invalid because of that? Like, is it like, if I own land, I own property in Verdun, I mean, what does that mean for me as an individual? I'm really asking the question, like, what does it mean for the suburbs around Ganawage and I don't know.
I think that's not my area of expertise. What I'm going to say is that But to answer your original question, was it a good thing? And I would say yes, because the Canadian Army didn't shoot everyone. When I was in the SQ,
Yeah.
thought it was okay to traumatize me and punch me in the face, but they didn't murder me.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the capacity for state violence is lower here, and you just can't get away with it. And the social tolerance for it is much lower as well. We're not going to let our reporters get murdered without it being a big hullabaloo. So I think that because of that, I survived, and it would have been a different story if I'd been in the U.S. Plus,
or imagine some other country like the U.S. is actually quite a civilized country. I mean, just compared to say China. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, that's another way to think about it.
And even the whole reason that
I don't mean China is uncivilized, just to be clear. But 1.7 million Uyghurs in concentration camps is a sign of state repression for religious reasons. But sorry, I just wanted to get that clear. That sounded really bad, but go ahead.
The reason that Robert Galbraith and I didn't also knew that we might be able to sneak through the perimeter was that we knew that the soldiers would point first and not shoot. That we weren't in danger of being immediately shot, and so that made a big difference. And that was Canada versus the U.S. The U.S. had another phenomenon. At Wounded Knee, they had a goon culture. So goon culture were these, like, I don't know, gangster type guys, some of whom were indigenous, who had guns, who liked to shoot people. So a lot of the activists were shot by goons, not by the police or by soldiers. There was a bit of goon culture at Oka, but not much. And so
you're making a case that the nationalism, if we can call it nationalism, the pride that we can feel about being, about Canada, is that it's a peaceful country, that it has less propensity to be wild and dangerous, and people die unnecessarily, if I understand you correctly, right?
And not only that, you can make an argument
peace, order, good government, I think, as opposed to the American concept of more wild freedoms, something like that.
I think you can make an argument that the rule of law and that the kind of you get tired of hearing politicians say, we are a country of laws and rules, but actually
pretty important.
Yeah, but
you don't. It's maybe cliche and everything, but not living in that can be very difficult with the incentives again.
Yeah,
right. You go back to the incentives.
Yeah.
If I live in a very, very dangerous environment where I'm in my little group of people and there's a bunch of people over there. My smartest thing to do, if there's no Leviathan pressing down on top of us to go to if we have a conflict, the smartest thing I can do is go and try and kill them first.
Yeah.
Right? Before they come and kill me. This is what Steven Pinker did in his book about the Better Angels, right? So you're making a case, I think, that Canada has a very effective rule of law, Leviathan, and we've become a civilized population as a result. Is that, think about it?
Yeah. There's another way to frame it too, which is that I think that what Oka did, and I think one of the most significant things that Oka did as a crisis, was that before, remember we were talking about the terrible stereotype of Native Indigenous people in Canada before, it completely revolutionized. It gave young Indigenous people pride. You saw these beautiful, empowered, well-spoken, cultured, strong people stand up for their land and their culture. And it revolutionized Native Indigenous culture. Everything that's happened now that's on CBC radio or whatever, the turning point was Oka. That before that, and there's a pretty good argument for saying that it's possible that there would have been a continued decline, because Wounded Knee seemed like a continued decline. And instead now we have Canada's a place where we have a lot of Indigenous pride, and you have the country benefits from it. We have great music and great art and great culture and maybe some great industry.
I mentioned Thompson Highway. Right? He's a well-known Cree writer, I believe.
And all this is indigenous based. So
it seems to me, if we could close on this positive note, it seems to me that the challenge after World War II for Canada was how to transition from being a British Empire-protected country to being a bilingual entity without the country going supernova. So, and then you could update that to the Oka Crisis was the beginning of the transition into the three-way thinking about Canada as being Anglo-Franco, or four-way sometimes, Anglo-Franco-Indigenous, and then all the 8 or 9 million people who are not native born in the country who also bring a lot into the country's culture as well. And it sounds like you're saying that the beginning of that process of redefining, I mean, Mary Simon, I think, was a turning point because she was appointed the Governor General of Canada, and she was the first one in, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 years who couldn't speak French. That was, I think that was, and she was Indigenous, and she said, I speak Cree, right? So that could be seen as a positive thing going forward. I don't know. Do you think it could be?
Absolutely. I remember I used to wonder. Remember when that movie Once Were Warriors came out? It showed how powerful and strong the Maori culture was in Australia and New Zealand, and I was like,
New Zealand, I think.
Yeah, New Zealand. I was like, how come we don't have the equivalent of that here, where we have so many Indigenous people? And the truth is that we do. One of the things I heard Buffy St. Marie on the radio the other day, and she said this thing that really struck me. She said, people don't know how great our cultures are. And so one of the things you learn if you open your eyes and ears in Canada, let's say as a non-Indigenous person, is that first of all, there's no one Indigenous kind of people. There's many.
That's the first fallacy that I hear all the time is Native Canadians. I mean, it's like Inuit and Cree and Mohawk. It's all these different nations or national identities.
There's an incredible difference in range, and that they have different characters and qualities, and they're just getting started in a way.
After a long period of
look at Inuit culture is fantastic and vital and vibrant, and so these things are so I would say Oka was positive in the long term despite the violence
for Canada as a national identity unit, right?
I sometimes disagree. I think that sometimes people point out that there was violence, but I say, I mean, kind of what do you expect? Everybody's got guns. Everybody's starting to kill each other. It kind of, all things considered, it wasn't so bad. Yeah.
Okay. So the final note I will say before we close this completely is I was checking the statistics the other day, and my numbers are like 97 downloads or something for all of them that I have access to right now. Because we're transitioning from arts and opinion, I'm going on to Spotify. I've created this thing on Podbean, so I'm in Podbean and I'm looking, and you can see where people have listened to your which for me is not that many places, but I was clicking on Canada and it had Quebec was the number one, and then a couple of it in Ontario, and then there was one in Nunavut. This is what made me think of it where you were talking about the culture. So I think to myself, if whoever's listening, if somebody is listening in Nunavut, this is sort of a shout out to you because it was one download. And also Nunavut is so big that there's like Canada. Looks like I have like half of Canada because I have Quebec, Ontario, then Nunavut, like all of the north. It's one guy who downloaded. So that's something nice. If that person maybe is listening, or if it was a freak occurrence, or maybe it's a VPN that's masking it up there. I don't know what's going on with that, but I just want to thank you. This has been for two reasons. One is it's just been such an incredible conversation.
Oh, really? Thank you.
Yeah, there's that part. And I do want to come back with you again on this exploration of Quebec and Canadian identity, because I think it's really important at this point. But the other thing is, I just want to thank you because you're kind of a name. If you have 11 million people, I mean, I just wanted to just thank you because you didn't have to do this with me, right? So, I appreciate that.
This is a funny thing about my life is that, sometimes you think of myself either as a filmmaker or a laughologist, but around the world, I am much better known as a hypnotist, which is hilarious because I'm not. I am a hypnotist, but it's not. I was not the person who set up. You see, I've just told you the story of how I became a hypnotist.
11 million people for that speech is huge.
I've done 2 TEDx's on hypnosis and 2 Idea Cities. So I've done 4. Wow. I've been just to give you an idea how weird it is. I got flown to New Delhi. I spoke after the Prime Minister of India, and they're like, "Here is a famous hypnotist, Robert Nerenberg." I'm like, hello. And
so you're bigger in India than you are. Is that right? Yeah. I mean, is that okay?
Oh yeah, I'm bigger as a hypnotist. A lot of people know me in India. Wow. A lot more than maybe in Canada.
That sort of makes sense somehow from what I know about India and the religiosity of that country. I think that's kind of So listen, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
it was really fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to today's guest on the Mega Blast podcast. I've been your host, Jason McDonald. This podcast is brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal, which is also available in the Permanent Archives of Canada. Visit us online at artsandopinion.com.